Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to Seraphina's romance stories if you stand with justice.
The pack left her to die. She couldn't shift, never had, the Omega who failed. So they sent her into the hunt anyway, alone, human, defenseless, blood on the forest floor, wolves closing in. Then the ground trembled. A massive wolf stepped through the trees, ethereal, glowing white, enormous, not hunting her, protecting her, the Alpha King's true form. His golden eyes locked on hers and something ignited in her chest, a golden thread she didn't know existed, burning between them like fire. "You," he whispered in a voice older than kingdoms. "You're mine." She wasn't an Omega. She was something else entirely. The blood moon only rises once a year. For every wolf in the Obsidian Ridge Pack, it was the most sacred night of the calendar. A night of running beneath the crimson sky, of honoring the ancient bond between flesh and beast, of celebrating the gift that separated them from the fragile, forgettable humans who scratched their short lives into the dirt below. For Evadne, it had always been the worst night of the year. And this year, she already knew, deep in the hollow of her chest where her wolf should have lived, that it would be her last. She heard the hunting horns first, 3 long, low wails bleeding through the dark tree line of the Ashfall Forest, the ancient woodland that bordered Obsidian Ridge territory to the north. The sound rolled across the jagged valley like a death knell, bouncing off the black rock faces of the surrounding mountains and returning as an echo, quieter, but no less final. Every wolf in the pack lifted their heads when they heard it. Every wolf except Evadne, who was already running. Her bare feet hit the frozen earth with each desperate stride, tearing against the sharp flint scattered across the forest floor like broken teeth. There were no boots. Alpha Garrick had made sure of that. "Oh, prey doesn't get boots," he had said, his black wolf's eyes flat with amusement as he'd kicked them from her hands in the clearing where the hunt was announced. Prey gets a head start. 2 minutes. That was what he'd given her. She'd been running for 4. The canopy overhead was so dense it choked out most of the crimson moonlight, leaving Evadne to navigate by feel and instinct alone, both of which were failing her. Roots erupted from the earth without warning, snagging her ankles. Low branches slapped her face, leaving thin lines of stinging heat across her cheeks. Her lungs were already burning, the cold mountain air scraping like iron filings against the inside of her chest with every ragged breath. But she kept running, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was dying. She could already hear them behind her. Not footsteps. Wolves didn't leave footsteps, not when they were hunting properly. What she could hear was far worse, the rhythmic, metronomic thud of massive paws vibrating through the ground itself, traveling up through the frozen earth and into the soles of her feet like a drumbeat, counting down the last seconds of her life. She could smell them too. That sharp, metallic bite of predatory hunger, cutting through the pine and frost scent of the forest. And above it all, high and gleeful and completely unmistakable, she heard Calith's howl. That was the one that made her stumble. Not from fear, though fear was certainly there, sitting cold and heavy at the base of her throat. She stumbled because she recognized that howl. She had grown up hearing it, from the training yards, from the pack halls, from outside her door on nights when sleep refused to come. She had heard it in joy and in cruelty, and in every flavor of contempt that existed between the two. She had heard Calith use that sound to call the pack to dinner, to signal a successful hunt, to announce a victory. She had never once imagined she would hear it used to signal her death. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Keep moving, keep moving, keep—" Her foot caught a root. She went down hard, palms slamming into the frozen ground, knees cracking against a half-buried rock. Pain detonated up through her wrists and into her shoulders, but she didn't cry out. Evadne had learned very early that crying out only encouraged them. She scrambled back upright before the momentum had even finished carrying her down, pushing herself forward on pure desperation. 18 years. She had survived 18 years in the Obsidian Ridge Pack on desperation alone. She had been found on the edge of their territory as an infant, a human baby, according to Garrick, which was the story he'd always told and the story the pack had always believed. Something left behind by parents who hadn't wanted it, a creature that shouldn't have been brought inside the walls at all. His own beta had argued against it, she'd been told later, though no one had ever confirmed the details. All she knew was that by the time she was old enough to understand what she was, or rather, what she wasn't, the verdict had already been delivered. She was an Omega. No, worse than an Omega. Omegas at least had wolves. Evadne had stood in the shifting circle 3 times. The first at age 12, when the pack gathered to watch the youngest generation make their first transformation, the forest floor trembling with the thunder of adolescent wolves discovering their forms for the very first time. She had stood in the center of that circle, closed her eyes, reached deep inside herself for the animal she was supposed to carry, and found nothing, only silence, an absence so total it felt like a wound. The second time was at 14. The elders had gathered specifically for her, murmuring to one another in voices they thought she couldn't hear. A rare late bloomer, perhaps, a delayed reaction. Sometimes the wolf hides deeper in some. They'd had her perform the ancient breathing exercises, the ritual postures, the spoken invocations. They'd burned the sacred herbs and traced the shifting glyphs onto her skin in silver ash and wolf oil. Nothing. The third time was at 16. By then, no one was speaking about late blooming anymore. Alpha Garrick had stood at the edge of the circle with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching with the expression of a man who had eaten something rotten and was deciding whether to spit it out. Kayleith had been there too, beautiful and smug, already shifted into her sleek amber wolf form because she could shift at will, and she wanted everyone present to remember that. Vane, Garrick's beta, had put Evadne through the ceremony himself, and when it produced nothing, he had backhanded her across the face hard enough to knock her off her feet. "Broken," he'd said to Garrick, stepping over her. "Obviously," Garrick had agreed. She had stopped trying after that, not because she'd given up hope entirely. Hope was stubborn, she had discovered, and it survived in the most hostile of conditions, but because she'd learned that trying and failing publicly was worse than not trying at all. At least silence was invisible. Failure had a face, so she had made herself useful in other ways. She had cooked and cleaned and mended and carried. She had learned every inch of the pack's territory and made herself into a near-perfect ghost, present enough to be functional, invisible enough to avoid drawing attention. She had watched and learned and waited, and told herself that one day something would change. She had been a fool. The howl behind her grew louder and closer, and she realized with a lurch of pure terror that they weren't even running at full speed. She could hear it in the easy, almost playful cadence of their movement, the looseness of it, the lack of urgency. Kayleith was directing them the way a cat directs the chase of a mouse, not closing in for the kill but steering the prey, exhausting it, enjoying the process. They weren't hunting her, they were playing with her. "Run, little human," Garrick's voice came back to her from the clearing, just before the horns had sounded. He'd crouched in front of her, a courtesy, he'd called it, dropping to her eye level, and he'd smiled the smile she had spent 18 years dreading, the one with too many teeth in it. "If the wilderness doesn't claim you, our fangs will. Either way, the pack is purged of its defect before the next moon rises. Consider it mercy. You could have been left on the mountain as a pup. Run, little human." She had, and it hadn't been enough. A shape hit her from the left. It came without sound. No warning growl, no telegraphed charge. just an explosion of gray fur and brutal force that caught her across the shoulder and sent her spinning sideways into the dark. The impact was enormous, the weight behind it staggering, and the world tilted sickeningly as she left her feet and became, for one weightless moment, nothing but a body falling through black air. She hit the roots of a massive oak at the base of a small rise, her head slamming against the ancient bark with a crack that sent white fire across her vision. For a long, terrible second, she couldn't see anything at all. Only white and then red, spreading at the edges like ink bleeding through wet paper. Then her vision returned in fragments, blurry and tilting, and she felt the warm slide of blood down the side of her face. She pressed her hand to the bark and tried to rise. Her arms wouldn't cooperate. Vane stepped out of the shadows. He hadn't even shifted back to human form. His massive gray wolf stood with all 4 feet planted in the leaves, his head low, his pale eyes fixed on her, with the bored contempt of a predator that has already decided the outcome and is merely performing the final formality. He was enormous in wolf form, the largest of the Ridge Pack, a point of pride that he reminded them of regularly. He could have ended it then, and she'd looked into enough pairs of eyes to know he was considering it. But Calith's baying cut through the trees, closer now, directing, and Vane stepped back. They wanted an audience. Of course they did. Garrick emerged from the tree line a moment later, his pitch-black wolf form a solid piece of the darkness that had simply detached itself and learned to walk. There was no other wolf in the pack whose form radiated malice the way his did. It wasn't just his size, though he was enormous, or his coloring, though the total absence of light in his coat made him look less like an animal and more like a void with teeth. It was something behind the eyes, something that looked at the world and sorted everything in it into 2 categories, things that were useful and things that weren't. Evadne had spent 18 years in the second category. Calith appeared last, shifting back to human form as she stepped into the small clearing around the oak tree. She was beautiful in the way that things designed to cause damage are often beautiful, sharp and precise and deliberately polished to a high shine. Her hair was perfect despite the run through the forest. Her smile was the one she reserved for moments when she had won something and wanted to make certain the other person understood the full scope of the loss. "Oh, look," Calith said, tilting her head at Evadne with an expression of performative sadness. "She made it further than I thought she would. I had you at the ridge line, personally. Vane thought you wouldn't clear the tree line at all." She glanced at Vane with the air of someone concluding a minor wager. "You owe me." Evadne pressed herself harder against the bark of the oak. Her legs had decided to work again. She could feel the sensation returning to her feet in sharp, pins and needles bursts, but there was nowhere to go. Garrick was directly ahead, Vane to her left, Calith to her right, the tree at her back. In the branches overhead she could hear the soft rustling of the rest of the pack settling into position, a ring of witnesses come to watch the end. She thought very clearly, this is it. She thought, 18 years, and it ends here, at the base of a tree in the cold, with Calith's smile as the last thing I see. She closed her eyes. She had told herself she wouldn't beg. Dignity was the one thing they hadn't managed to take from her, not for lack of trying, and she wasn't going to surrender it now. She had spent a childhood biting back tears in front of people who fed on them. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of the last, final offering. Let it be quick, she thought instead, the closest thing to a prayer she had ever attempted. Let it be quick, and let it be done. Calith stepped forward. Evadne heard the small shift of weight, the soft compression of leaves underfoot. She felt the air change in the way it changes when something predatory is closing the last of the distance between itself and what it intends to destroy. She felt Calith's wolf stir beneath the polished surface. Felt it the way you feel a storm before the first crack of lightning, that static charge raising every hair on your skin. She braced herself, and then the world stopped. It didn't slow, it didn't fade, it stopped. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Evadne's breath became visible in the air before her face, white vapor, suspended, motionless. Calith's footstep halted mid-stride. The rustling in the branches above went silent. Even the wind died, completely and instantly, as though someone had reached into the sky and closed a fist around it. And then the pressure hit. It was unlike anything Evadne had ever felt in her life. Not pain, it didn't hurt, not exactly, but a weight of sheer, crushing authority that descended on the clearing the way a mountain might descend if mountains could move. It pressed down on everything, the trees and the leaves and the frozen earth, and it pressed down hardest on the wolves. Garrick made a sound she had never heard him make in 18 years. He whimpered. His massive pitch-black form buckled, legs folding, until he was pressed flat against the forest floor with his head down and his eyes wide. And terrified, she realized, because she could see the whites of them. Alpha Garrick of Obsidian Ridge, the most feared wolf in 3 territories, was lying flat on his belly in the dirt with terror written plainly across his face. Vane went down a half-second later, not buckling but dropping, as though his legs had simply ceased to function. Calith's perfect control shattered so completely that she didn't even manage a sound before she hit the ground, her wolf rising instinctively in response to the threat, only to be flattened just as instantly by the force rolling through the clearing like a tide. The wolves in the trees above her fled, crashing through the branches with panicked, graceless abandon, the sounds of their escape swallowed immediately by the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. Evadne still had her back against the oak. She still had her eyes half closed, and she was the only one in the clearing who was still standing. She didn't understand it. She turned her head slowly, searching the darkness between the trees for the source of what she was feeling. Because it was coming from somewhere, that pressure, that authority, and whatever was generating it was close. She could feel it in her chest now, resonating against her ribs, vibrating in her sternum in a way that should have been terrifying. It wasn't terrifying. It felt impossibly like safety. Footsteps, human ones, measured, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of someone who had never once in their life needed to hurry because the world rearranged itself around their pace. Through the trees, a figure emerged from the dark, and Evadne's world cracked open at the seams. She had heard the stories. Everyone in every territory from the northern mountains to the southern coast had heard the stories. They were told to pups to teach them about the structure of the world, the way you told children about the sun to explain why things cast shadows. He was not a myth, but he had the particular quality of myths, the sense that he existed in a category slightly apart from ordinary reality, that the rules which governed other things did not quite apply to him. Alpha King Valerius. He wasn't in wolf form. He didn't need to be. His human form radiated an aura so absolute in its dominance that every wolf in the clearing, every wolf, including Garrick, was already pressed to the earth without him having said a single word. He walked out of the shadows as though the darkness had been waiting to release him, and the crimson moonlight caught the hard angles of his face and turned them to something that looked less like flesh and more like a warning carved in stone. His eyes swept the clearing, taking in the groveling forms of Garrick, Vane, and Calith, with an expression of cold disgust so complete it could have stripped paint. And then they landed on Evadne. She watched his gaze change. Not dramatically, not obviously, but she was close enough, and she had spent enough of her life learning to read the small movements in people's faces that the powerful refused to let become large ones. That she caught it, that fraction of a second where something shifted behind those molten gold eyes. Not pity, not what she would have expected from anyone discovering her bleeding and broken against a tree. Something that looked almost like recognition. He stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned toward Garrick, and when he spoke, his voice rolled through the clearing like a wave of thunder that hadn't quite broken yet. "What is the meaning of this, Garrick?" Garrick, who had not lifted his head from the dirt, managed to do something with his body that conveyed the posture of a man trying to appear dignified while prostrate on the forest floor. He failed completely. "She is a defect, Your Grace." His voice came out choked, pressed flat by the weight of the aura pinning him down. "A broken human masquerading as a wolf. She has no place in our world. We were merely purging the... on my treaty grounds." The 3 words landed like stones dropped from a great height. Garrick went silent. Valerius let the silence sit for a moment, the kind of silence that had been specifically constructed to communicate something, the way the pause before a sentence's most important word communicates that everything before it was preamble. Then he turned back toward Evadne, and those gold eyes moved over her with an attention so focused it felt almost physical, and then something changed in his face, not softening, that wasn't the right word for it, deepening, like something that had been a flat surface was suddenly revealing depth. "You fools," he said. His voice had dropped, not in volume, it was still completely, unnervingly calm, but in register, and in the thing underneath the words, that charged and dangerous quality of a man who has just understood something that the people around him have catastrophically failed to understand. "You haven't been harboring a weakling." He took one step toward Evadne, and she could feel the air around him, warm despite the cold, and that resonance against her ribs deepened into something she had no name for. "You've been suppressing a god." Evadne opened her mouth. No sound came out. The blood from her temple was running into her eye, and her legs were finally, definitively giving out beneath her, and the last thing she saw before her vision began its final retreat into blackness was Valerius, the Alpha King, the legend, the unmovable center of a world she had never belonged to, moving toward her with intention in his eyes and something in his expression that she would not have been able to name if she had 1,000 years to try. She did not have 1,000 years. She had approximately 4 more seconds of consciousness. They were enough. As the darkness came for her, not the terrifying darkness of Calith's approach, but something quieter, something that felt almost like rest. She felt the presence she had been registering in her chest change in quality. The safety she had felt when he entered the clearing deepened into something absolute, something ancient, something that reached into the part of her that had been hollowed out and silent since birth, and pressed against it like a key turning in a lock. Something buried deep in her soul shifted, something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. "What is?" she thought. And then she was gone. But the thing inside her was just beginning to wake up. In the 43 years that Garrick of Obsidian Ridge had led his pack, he had never been afraid. Not truly afraid, not the kind of afraid that hollowed you out from the inside and replaced everything that had been there. Pride, certainty, the comfortable weight of dominance, with something cold and structureless that had no name and no floor to it. He had experienced versions of fear, certainly, the functional, useful kind that sharpened the senses before a territorial confrontation, the momentary adrenaline-bright kind that came in the first second of genuine danger before instinct took over and redirected it into aggression. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that didn't redirect anywhere. It simply sat on him, enormous and immovable, pressing him flat against the cold forest floor with a weight so complete that even the idea of rising felt not just physically impossible, but somehow philosophically absurd. As if standing upright were a concept that only applied to other things, lesser things, things that existed in a world where Alpha King Valerius was not presently standing 8 feet away in the dark. Garrick had always privately doubted the stories. He didn't doubt them anymore. He had heard, as everyone had heard, about the aura. The old wolves called it the sovereign pressure, a quality found only in the bloodline of the first Alpha Kings, the ancient rulers who had shaped the wolf territories in the centuries before borders had been drawn and treaties signed. The stories described it as a force of pure dominance made manifest, a weight in the air that pressed every wolf in range into submission regardless of their own rank or power, a declaration of hierarchy so absolute it bypassed conscious choice entirely and spoke directly to the animal beneath the skin. He had always thought it was exaggeration. It was not exaggeration. If anything, the stories had undersold it. They had described a pressure. They had not described the way that pressure carried intelligence, the unmistakable sense that it was not merely a force radiating outward from the man at its center, but a directed, purposeful weight that knew exactly where to push and exactly how hard. It was the difference between a flood and a fist. A flood simply overwhelmed. A fist chose its point of contact, and right now it was choosing Garrick. "On my treaty grounds," Valerius said again. The repetition was worse than any volume would have been. A shouted accusation could be survived. It had edges, and edges meant it would eventually run out of itself. This was calm. Calm meant it had no endpoint. Calm meant the man speaking it had decided on a conclusion long before he opened his mouth, and the words were merely the formal announcement of something already settled. Garrick tried again to find his voice. "Your Grace." The words came out wrong, too thin, too fast, the voice of a man trying to sound dignified while lying in his own dirt with his belly pressed to the earth like a pup caught stealing from the Alpha's plate. She is not, she has never been, the girl is a defect, unshifted at 18. No wolf, no power, no... I know what she is. The words fell so precisely that Garrick stopped mid-sentence. Valerius had not raised his voice. He had not shifted his stance, had not taken another step, had not altered the controlled, almost architectural stillness with which he had been standing since he emerged from the tree line. And yet the three words landed with the specific force of a man who had not only just seen through every lie in the clearing, but had already determined that they were not worth the effort of a full refutation. He turned away from Garrick. That was somehow worse than being addressed. Garrick had seen other powerful wolves dismiss subordinates, the practiced, precise cut of turning the back as a message about relevance. He had done it himself, hundreds of times. But this was different. Valerius turned away from him not as an insult delivered with intention. He turned away because Garrick had become, in the space of 30 seconds, simply not the most important thing in the clearing. What was the most important thing in the clearing was the girl bleeding against the oak tree. Valerius moved toward her, and the pack, what remained of it, the few wolves who hadn't fled into the darkness, flattened themselves further into the earth as he passed, not from any increase in the aura, but from the simple, instinctive terror of being proximate to that much concentrated authority. Kalith, who hadn't made a sound since the Alpha King arrived, had her face pressed fully into the leaves. Vane hadn't moved at all. He lay precisely where he had fallen, and Garrick could see from the fixed, empty quality of his beta's expression that Vane had stopped attempting anything and was simply enduring the experience with whatever structural integrity he had remaining. Valerius crouched in front of Evadne. Garrick watched him look at her and felt something deeply unsettling move through his chest. Not guilt, he had shed that particular capacity long ago, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the first cold breath of consequence. Because Valerius's face had changed. Garrick knew faces. He had spent 43 years reading the faces of wolves who were trying to hide what they felt, and he had become very good at identifying the fissures where the truth leaked through. What he saw in the Alpha King's expression now was not what he had expected. He had expected assessment, perhaps controlled disgust at the scene he had walked into. the political calculus of a treaty violation and what punishment it necessitated. He had expected the face of a king performing the function of a king. He did not expect what he actually saw. Valerius's jaw had tightened in a way that suggested the controlled stillness of his expression was costing him something. His eyes, those unsettling, molten gold eyes that had been moving through the clearing with the dispassion of a judge, had stilled completely on Evadne's face, not moving, not cataloguing, fixed, and then his nostrils flared. Garrick saw the exact moment it hit him. A scent. Whatever he had caught in the air above the girl's bleeding form, it struck the Alpha King like a physical thing. The subtle seizing of his shoulders, the fractional but unmistakable tension that moved through his entire body in a single wave. Valerius went absolutely rigid for the span of 2 heartbeats, and when he exhaled, the breath came out slower than it had gone in. Garrick did not understand what he was witnessing, but some ancient, deeply buried instinct in him understood it perfectly, and that instinct was screaming. Valerius reached out and moved the hair from Evadne's face with a gentleness so complete it was almost shocking in contrast to the absolute force of the presence that had flattened the entire clearing 60 seconds earlier. His thumb hovered over the silver veins that had appeared at her temple. Veins that hadn't been there before, Garrick realized, or hadn't been visible before. Thin traceries of light barely visible beneath the skin, pulsing faintly in the dark. He pulled his hand back, stood up slowly. And when he turned back toward the prostrate wolves of Obsidian Ridge, his face was no longer controlled. The stillness was still there, that absolute structural calm, but something behind it had changed in quality. It was no longer the calm of a king conducting an assessment. It was the specific, quiet, devastating calm of a man who has just had confirmed something he had already decided he was not going to forgive. "You fools," he said. The words were quiet. They were the quietest thing he had said since entering the clearing, and they were, by an enormous margin, the most frightening. "You haven't been harboring a weakling." His eyes moved across Garrick, across Vane, across the trembling, prostrate form of Caliph, with an expression that stripped each of them down to their component parts and found nothing of value. "You've been suppressing a god." Garrick didn't understand the words, but the wolf inside him did, and the wolf inside him had just decided that it very much wanted to be somewhere else. "Your Grace." He tried one more time, pushing the words past the weight on his chest by sheer force of alpha habit.
"Whatever you believe you see, she is unshifted, powerless. I've tested her myself 3 times over 16 years. There is nothing inside her. Whatever you think you smell, it is—"
"I know exactly what I smell." Valerius turned to look at him, and Garrick went silent. Not because he had been commanded to, not because of the aura or the authority, or the treaty violation hanging over the clearing like a sword that hadn't fallen yet.
Because of what was in the Alpha King's eyes. Garrick had seen anger, he had seen rage, he had seen
the volcanic, boundary-dissolving fury of wolves who had been pushed past the point of calculated response into something pure and ungoverned. He had weaponized all of those things himself over 43 years of leadership. What he saw in Valerius's eyes was none of those things. It was colder than fury and more total than rage, and older than anything Garrick had a name for. It was the expression of a man who had just catalogued everything in a situation, assessed every relevant factor, arrived at a conclusion, and was now existing in the space between that conclusion and the moment he acted on it. The space was very small. "You will not move," Valerius said to the clearing at large, the words landing with the absolute authority of a law being written in real time rather than a request being made. "You will not speak, and you will not, under any circumstances, take your eyes from what is about to happen." Then he turned back toward the girl, because behind him, pressed against the roots of the ancient oak, something extraordinary was beginning. The blood had continued to pool from the wound at Evadne's temple while the clearing held its frozen tableau. It had traced a line down her jaw and dripped, dark and gleaming, from the angle of her chin into the frozen earth. But now, and Garrick saw it, and Calith saw it, and Vane saw it, because Valerius had told them to watch, and the weight of that instruction made looking away unthinkable. The blood had begun to change. Not the color of it, the light in it. Thin threads of silver had appeared in the dark red, barely visible, barely there, spreading outward from the point of impact on her temple, through the blood and into the skin below. The silver veins Valerius had examined were no longer faint. They were brightening, slowly, in pulses, in a rhythm that corresponded to nothing except perhaps a heartbeat. Though not Evadne's, which was growing weaker, they were waking up. The air in the clearing shifted, not with pressure this time, with something else, something that came from inside the roots of the oak behind Evadne, and from the frozen ground beneath her, and from the girl herself. It smelled like starlight would smell if starlight had a scent, clean and ancient and absolutely, devastatingly present in a way that the rest of the physical world suddenly seemed, by comparison, to be slightly less real than. Garrick heard Calith make a sound. It was not the high, gleeful sound of the hunt. It was not a sound he had ever heard Calith make in all the years he had known her. It was a sound of pure, undiluted terror. Valerius knelt beside the girl, and the silver light moved toward his hands, reached for them, pulled by something that was either the mate bond or something older and more elemental. And his voice, when he spoke, was no longer the voice of a king delivering an edict. It was the voice of a man who had waited a very long time for something and had just found it, bleeding in the dark. "Something is terribly wrong here," he said, and he was only half right. Something was terribly wrong, yes, but something else, something that had been suppressed and buried and silenced for 18 years, was about to become very, very right.
The first memory Evadne had that was entirely her own was of a shifting ceremony that wasn't hers. She was 6 years old. The pack had gathered in the valley clearing where all important rituals were conducted. A wide, flat expanse of grass and packed earth at the center of Obsidian Ridge territory. Torches lined the perimeter. The elder wolves arranged themselves in the inner ring. Behind them, the rest of the pack pressed close, their collective energy a warm, almost tangible thing in the cold evening air. A boy named Calder was shifting for the first time. He was 8 years old, dark-haired, vibrating with a mixture of terror and barely contained excitement. Evadne watched from the very back of the crowd, standing on her toes to see over the adults in front of her. She remembered thinking, "I want that." Not in a complicated way, just the pure, uncomplicated wanting of a child who sees something extraordinary and desires it completely, without any awareness of cost. Calder shifted. First shifts were never smooth, the body fighting itself, resisting the change even as it underwent it. He cried out once, and then the cry transformed into something else, and then the light came, blue-white and brief, and then there was a wolf where the boy had been, small, unsteady, bewildered, with enormous paws and a slightly dazed expression. The pack erupted. Evadne felt the wave of collective joy and pride break over her at the back, and she felt, at 6 years old, something she would spend the next 12 years trying not to examine too closely. She felt left out. She pressed her small hands together and watched Calder's mother rush forward, shift mid-stride, and gather the small wolf pup against her. She watched the elder wolves bow their heads in acknowledgement, the torchlight making everything gold and warm and belonging. She told herself, "My turn will come." She had been found at the base of the northern ridge in early winter, approximately 3 days old, wrapped in cloth that carried no scent anyone could identify. The wolves who found her brought her back not out of warmth toward human infants, but out of the straightforward calculus of a cold night and a baby that would not survive the morning. Garrick had decided to keep her. He deployed this fact occasionally as evidence of his own magnanimity. She had spent years trying to determine what it meant. Whether it constituted a debt, whether it explained his particular brand of contempt, whether his decision to keep her and his subsequent treatment of her were connected by logic she was missing, or simply two contradictory facts that existed without resolution. By 16, she had settled on the simplest explanation. He had kept her because a human child on the territory was useful, a reminder to the pack of what they were not. A contrast, an example close enough to see clearly of what the world looked like without the gift. She was the pack's cautionary tale. What she had never been was loved, not by Garrick, whose acknowledgement of her existence was calibrated to the precise minimum required by basic household functioning, not by his mate Sarah, who had died when Evadne was 4 and whose presence she barely remembered beyond a vague impression of warmth that may have been reconstructed from wishful thinking, not by the pack's adults who managed her with the distancing efficiency of people dealing with something technically their responsibility, but fundamentally not their concern. There had been small kindnesses from unexpected directions. An older Omega named Bryn, who taught her to read from worn volumes, kept hidden under her sleeping pallet. A young packmate named Dort, who had, for approximately 2 years when they were both 8, been something resembling a friend before pack hierarchy asserted itself, and he began pretending not to know her in front of others. A visiting elder who pressed bread into her hands one winter evening and walked away before she could thank him. But kindnesses offered quietly in corners were not the same as belonging. The first shifting ceremony at 12 she had tried to describe to exactly one person in her life, once, and had immediately regretted it when she saw their expression change from curiosity to pity to the controlled awkwardness of someone handed an emotion they didn't know what to do with. So, she had kept it private instead. What she carried was the memory of the sound. 200 wolves gathered in the valley, clearing, watching, Elder Marin guiding her through the breathing exercises with professional patience that had not yet curdled into pity. The particular quality of silence that fell when Evadne closed her eyes and reached for what was supposed to be inside her, and found only silence instead, not a dramatic void, not a locked door pushing back against her reaching, just absence, clean, complete, without bottom, the way a room sounds when you expect furniture and find bare walls. She kept her eyes closed longer than necessary because she didn't want to see the faces. When she finally looked, she saw Marin's careful neutrality, the professional face of someone managing disappointment. And behind her, the crowd. 200 wolves processing information they hadn't expected, the uncomfortable ripple of collective recalibration. Eyes moving away with the particular quality she would learn to identify as the specific avoidance of people who had decided not to be involved. She walked back through the crowd alone. Nobody stopped her. She sat on the edge of her pallet and looked at her hands for a long time, trying to understand what was wrong with them. They looked like hands. They felt like hands. She turned them over, studying the palms, the small scar on her left thumb from a kitchen knife the previous winter. Just human hands. She pressed them flat against her thighs and told herself this changed nothing. She would try again at 14. Late blooming was possible. Bodies moved at their own pace. She almost believed it. The cruelty had a source, and its name was Calith. Calith was 2 years older than Evadne, and had been beautiful since birth, in the way that made adults uncomfortable when they tried to discipline her. She had shifted at 11, earlier than almost anyone in the pack's recorded history, a fact she knew precisely and deployed regularly. And by the time Evadne's first failed ceremony gave her a target, Calith had already spent a year consolidating her position as the pack's most socially lethal adolescent. She had a talent for finding the exact shape of a wound and pressing it. It was never loud. Garrick had taught his pack efficiency, and Calith had learned well. Nothing wasteful in how she operated, no unnecessary spectacle, no excess beyond what was precisely required for the intended effect. She never called Evadne names in front of adults. She never left marks requiring explanation. What she did was simpler and more durable. She made sure Evadne was never allowed to forget what she was. A word in the right ear, and the kitchen helper who had begun treating Evadne with something approaching warmth would suddenly become distant. A casual mention at the wrong moment, and the seat Evadne had been occupying at communal meals would be taken the next evening, and the evening after that, until Evadne stopped attending communal meals entirely. Small redirections. Gentle adjustments. The sustained, patient work of a girl who had decided that Evadne's isolation was a project worth maintaining. There was also Vane. Vane's methods were less subtle. He was Garrick's beta, operating with the certainty of a man whose position shielded him from consequence. He had hit her for the first time when she was 9 for dropping a serving dish. He had done it in front of the kitchen staff, and nobody said anything. That, not the blow itself, but the silence that followed, was what she had carried. Not the pain, the silence. The communal, collective decision of everyone present to look at a different part of the room while a child was taught she had no protection. What they had not managed to take from her was her fundamental orientation toward the world. She had remained, despite everything, stubbornly, infuriatingly kind. Not in a simple way. Not in the way of someone who hadn't understood what the world was. She had understood perfectly. She had simply decided somewhere along the way that the alternative was worse. She had stitched Dort's torn shirt back together the winter he stopped speaking to her in public, leaving it folded outside his door without a note. She had carried water to old Marin when the elder's joints were bad, without being asked, without expectation of acknowledgement. She had, on 6 separate occasions over 3 years, talked pups who had wandered too close to the northern ridge back to safety, never mentioning it to anyone. She gave quietly, because she had nothing else to give, and she kept the dreams to herself. They had started at 15, shortly after the second failed ceremony. Vivid, specific dreams that felt less like ordinary sleep and more like memory. A vast silver landscape under a sky thick with stars. A howl resonating in the hollow of her chest in a way nothing in her waking life ever had. The sensation of running. Not fleeing, not chasing. Just running. With her whole body committed to the movement in a way she had never experienced on 2 feet. She woke crying every time, because it felt like something lost rather than something imagined. She never told anyone, because the dreams were the one thing that still felt like hers. In the clearing of the ancient oak, Valerius examined the scars on Evadne's arms where her sleeves had torn in the hunt. His jaw tightened, and then tightened further. He had spent 40 years reading what marks left on a body communicated. He knew battle scars, training accidents, the ordinary violence Wolfkin did to itself in daily existence. He could read the story that damage wrote on skin the way other men read text on a page. These were not battle scars. They were old, deliberate, and patterned in a way that told a single story, written repeatedly over years in the same locations by hands that knew exactly where to leave their signature without making it visible to anyone not looking for it. The controlled stillness of his expression fractured, not into grief, into rage. The specific, tightly leashed rage of a man who has identified something he intends to address completely and without remainder at the earliest available opportunity. He exhaled slowly, looked at her face, silver veins still pulsing, still brightening, carrying the unmistakable signature of power so ancient it had no name in any current text, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned toward Garrick. "How long?" he said quietly. "Has she been in your pack?" Garrick, still pressed to the earth, managed, 18 years, Your Grace." Valerius looked back at Evadne. 18 years, he repeated. The words were directed inward, at something no one else in the clearing could see. 18 years of this, written on her skin. 18 years of power so vast it glowed in the blood, buried under deliberate and sustained suppression by people who had known exactly what they were sitting on and had made a calculated choice to keep it down. Who else knew? He thought. And how was it done? He already knew the answers would not be simple. He gathered her into his arms, carefully, completely, with the deliberateness of someone who had decided that no further damage would be permitted, and stood. She weighed almost nothing. That, somehow, was the worst thing. He turned to the wolves of Obsidian Ridge, groveling in the leaves and dirt of their own hunting ground, and delivered his verdict with the flat certainty of a man who had already moved past the decision to the logistics of its implementation. "You will not move from this clearing until my guard arrives. You will answer every question you are asked completely and truthfully, and you will pray that what I discover about this girl's history does not exceed what I have already seen tonight." His eyes moved across each of them. "Because what I have already seen tonight will cost you everything you have." He turned away and walked out of the dark forest and into the first gray suggestion of dawn, carrying the sleeping queen in his arms, while behind him the 3 wolves who had spent 18 years suppressing a god pressed their faces into the cold earth and said nothing at all.
The royal healers had a saying, "The body never lies." It was the first thing apprentices were taught when they entered the king's healing chambers at the capital, before they learned herb lore or wound dressing or the long, precise taxonomy of Wolfkind's injuries and ailments. Before anything practical, they were sat down and told, "Whatever a patient tells you, whatever a patient believes, whatever story has been constructed around a body by the people who surround it, set it aside. Start with what the body is actually saying, because the body never lies." Master Healer Soren had been saying it for 30 years, had said it so many times it had long since ceased to feel like instruction and become simply part of the architecture of how he understood his work. He said it to apprentices. He said it to colleagues. He had said it once to a king, not the current one, the previous one, Valerius's father, in a context that had nearly ended his career and that he still considered one of the finest moments of his professional life. He had never, in 30 years, encountered a body that tested the principle the way this one did. They had brought her to the eastern chamber of the king's stronghold, not the main healing ward, which was accessed by the general court and staffed by a rotating roster of junior healers, but the private chamber on the eastern tower that Soren used for cases requiring either exceptional delicacy or exceptional secrecy, and which had housed over the years a significant proportion of both. Valerius had carried her in himself. Soren had been in the corridor when they arrived, summoned by a runner 40 minutes earlier with a message that contained exactly 4 words. "Come to the east. Now." He had come, and he had stood in the corridor outside the eastern chamber and watched the Alpha King of all wolf territories carry an unconscious, bleeding girl through the door with an expression on his face that Soren, who had known Valerius for 20 years, had never seen him wear before. He hadn't said anything about that expression. He had followed them in and begun his examination. The head wound was the first thing. Clean, deep, already beginning to slow. The body's ordinary competent response to damage. Nothing unusual. He cleaned it and dressed it with the precise economy of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times, working quickly while Valerius stood near the window with his back to the room in the way he stood when he was containing something he didn't want visible on his face. The bruising came next. Soren documented it silently, his expression professionally neutral, noting locations and approximate ages with the part of his mind trained to read violence the way a scholar reads a text. Fresh bruising consistent with a fall. That was tonight. Older bruising, multiple sites, varying stages of resolution. That was not tonight. That was a pattern. He pressed his lips together and said nothing and kept working. Then he found the silver veins. He had noticed them when she was first brought in. It was impossible not to notice them. They were visible even to the naked eye now, tracing the lines of her circulatory system from her temple downward in thin, luminous threads. But he had set them aside while he addressed the acute injuries, cataloging them as something to return to, something that required more than a passing assessment. Now he returned to them. He brought the examination glass close, a polished crystal lens in a brass frame, ground specifically for close tissue work, and studied the veins at her wrist where they were most visible. What he saw made him pull the glass back and look at it, reflexively, as though the instrument might be the problem. Then he brought it close again. The silver wasn't in the veins. It was around them, threaded through the tissue itself, woven into the cellular structure of the skin in a pattern so fine it was invisible without magnification, so complex it looked less like a biological feature and more like... He turned her wrist slightly in the light and felt something move in his chest that he recognized, after a moment, as the specific unease of a man confronting something that doesn't fit his existing categories. Like writing. Not writing in any alphabet he knew, but writing in the way that fundamental things were written. Not in symbols designed by human or wolf minds, but in the older, deeper language that the world used to describe itself. Pattern that carried meaning, structure that communicated. He set her wrist down carefully. "Valerius," he said. The Alpha King turned from the window. Soren had known him for 20 years, and in that time he had learned to read the specific vocabulary of Valerius's controlled expressions, the fine gradations between assessment and calculation and decision, the slight variations in stillness that corresponded to different internal states. The face that Valerius brought to the examination table was not one Soren had a name for. "The head wound is manageable," Soren said. "She'll have a scar. The other injuries..." He paused, choosing words with care. "The other injuries are consistent with prolonged, repeated physical abuse over a number of years. I can give you a full documentation if you need it for the tribunal." Valerius's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "What else?" he said. It was not a question. Soren turned back to the girl. "Come and look at this." He positioned the examination glass over the veins at her wrist and moved aside to let Valerius look. He watched the Alpha King's eyes adjust to the magnification, watched the moment the focus resolved, and Valerius saw what was there. His breathing changed. "What is it?" Valerius said. Still not a question. The phrasing of a man who already knows the answer is going to require him to do something significant and is preparing himself. "I don't know," Soren said, which was not a sentence he used lightly. "Not precisely. I know what it resembles. I've seen diagrams, in the archive texts, the pre-territorial records, the old documents from before the first Alpha Kings consolidated the packs." He moved to the shelves along the eastern wall, where he kept the volumes he used most regularly, then stopped. "Not here. What I need is in the lower archive." "Then go." "I want to leave a junior." "I'll stay with her," Valerius said. Soren looked at him for a moment. Then he gathered his lamp and went. The lower archive was 3 levels beneath the stronghold's main floor, carved directly into the bedrock and lined with shelves that predated the current structure by several centuries. The oldest texts lived here, not the histories which were kept in the upper library for general scholarly access, but the prehistories. The records that had been assembled not by historians working from established fact, but by the first scholars of wolfkind trying to document things that older wolves remembered and that left no other physical evidence. Soren knew exactly which shelf he needed. He had visited it twice in 30 years. Once as a young apprentice, exploring out of pure academic curiosity. Once at 40, when a dying elder had described symptoms that matched nothing in the standard medical texts, and Soren had come down here looking for alternatives, and found in a crumbling volume of pre-territorial lore a description that matched precisely, and that had told him the elder was not dying of any disease but of old age in a form specific to wolves of a certain bloodline, and that there was nothing to be done, and that the knowledge had been considered lost for 2 centuries. He found the volume he needed on the 3rd shelf from the floor. It was bound in material he had never been able to identify with certainty. Not leather, not wood, not any processed plant fiber he recognized. And the text inside was written in a script that was primarily Old Wolfic, with occasional passages in something older that scholars still hadn't fully decoded. He carried it back upstairs. Valerius had not moved from the chair beside the examination table. He was not watching Evadne with the clinical attention of a man conducting an assessment. He was watching her with the stillness of someone standing guard, positioned between the door and the table, oriented outward, the posture of a wolf whose instincts had decided that proximity to this particular sleeping form was not optional. Soren noted this and filed it under the category of things he would think about later. He set the volume on the secondary table and opened it to the section he had located in the archive, a passage he had read twice 40 years ago and had not thought about since, because 40 years ago it had been interesting historical scholarship and nothing more. Now, reading it again with the examination glass resting on the table beside him and the girl's silver veins visible from across the room, it was something significantly different. The lichen protectress, Soren said. He felt rather than saw Valerius go still. The pre-territorial records reference it across 17 separate sources, Soren continued, his finger moving along the text with the careful attention of a man who wants to be precise. A bloodline, not an individual. A hereditary form, not a standard wolf shift, not any variant catalogued in the current taxonomy. Something older, something that predates the pack structure entirely. He turned a page. The descriptions are inconsistent in their details, as you'd expect from oral history committed to writing across different regions and time periods, but they converge on a few specific characteristics. He looked up. Silver light, celestial form, catastrophic power output. He paused. And silver veins, visible beneath the skin, that become active under conditions of extreme trauma or extreme... The word here is complicated. It's an old wolfic compound, extreme recognition, which the marginal notes from a later scholar translate as mate bond proximity. The room was very quiet. The bloodline was believed extinct, Soren said. The last confirmed record of an active lichen protectress form is approximately 900 years old. After that, references to it appear only in the context of historical record and theoretical scholarship. He closed the volume. Whatever suppressed this girl's power, it suppressed something that the academic community has classified as mythological for the better part of a millennium. Valerius stood up from the chair. He moved to the examination table and looked down at Evadne, at the silver veins, still pulsing, still brightening in slow, rhythmic waves, still doing something that Soren's 30 years of medical practice didn't have adequate language for, and was silent for a long time. Is there a record, Valerius said finally, of how a suppression would be performed on a power of this magnitude? Soren had been hoping he wouldn't ask that. Yes, he said. And? It would require someone with significant magical knowledge, access to the subject from birth or close to it. He paused. And a deliberate, sustained intention to keep it down. It wouldn't be a single act. It would be ongoing, maintained. Valerius turned from the table. Someone inside Obsidian Ridge, he said. Someone who knew what she was from the beginning, Soren confirmed, and chose to bury it. Valerius crossed to the window. Outside, the dawn had fully broken, gold and clean, completely indifferent to the gravity of what had just been spoken aloud in the eastern chamber. He stood with his back to the room for a long time, looking out at the morning, and Soren waited with the patience of a man who understood that some silences needed to run their course. "There's more," Soren said, when enough time had passed. "In the prophetic appendix of the pre-territorial records, a passage about the Lycan Protectress bloodline." Valerius didn't turn around. "Tell me." Soren opened the volume again, found the page, read it silently first to ensure his translation was accurate. Then he read it aloud, slowly, in the measured cadence of a man delivering something that changes the shape of what came before it. When he finished, the silence was different in quality from the one that had preceded it. "Only part of it," Valerius said. His voice was very controlled. "You'll share only part of that with the court." "Which part?" "The part that doesn't change how everyone in this stronghold looks at her when she wakes up," Valerius said. "She has spent 18 years being looked at as something other than a person. That ends now. She wakes up to normal. She wakes up to safe." He finally turned from the window, and the expression on his face was one that Soren had seen only a handful of times in 20 years. Not the calculated authority of a king, but something underneath it. Something that had been there long before the title. "Everything else waits until she is ready." Soren looked at him for a moment. Then he closed the volume and nodded. "As you say," he said quietly. In the chair beside the examination table, the silver veins at Evadne's wrists pulsed once, brighter than before, strong enough this time to cast a faint light across the backs of her sleeping hands, and then settled, waiting.
Evadne woke to silence. Not the silence of the forest, which was never truly silent, always threaded with wind through branches, soil settling, distant nocturnal creatures conducting their lives in the spaces between human awareness. Not the silence of her room in the Obsidian Ridge pack hall either, which had its own texture. Building creaks, muffled pack life bleeding through thin walls, the particular quality of quiet that exists where you are technically present, but fundamentally alone. This silence was different. This silence was safe. She didn't know how she knew that before she knew anything else. Before she knew where she was, or how she'd arrived, or whether her head still hurt. It did, distantly, a low, persistent ache behind her left temple, present but controlled like something that had been worse and was now being managed. Before any of that, the silence reached her, and something in her chest that had been clenched so long she had stopped registering it as tension simply released. She opened her eyes. Stone ceiling, pale gray, arching into a vaulted curve that caught morning light from a window she couldn't see, and distributed it evenly across the room. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had slept on. Not extravagantly so, not luxury performing itself, but the simple, functional softness of bedding selected by someone who understood that rest was a necessity rather than a reward. She turned her head slowly, in the chair beside the bed, positioned close enough to be within arm's reach but angled slightly away. The specific placement of someone who had been watching and adjusted their posture when they sensed her waking. Sat Valerius. He was reading a document, dense with text, working through it with the focused attention of a man reviewing something for the third or fourth time. His jaw was set. The controlled stillness she remembered from the forest was present, but different here. Less the stillness of a king performing authority, more the stillness of a person thinking very hard about something and temporarily forgetting to manage his expression. She watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake. In the forest, with crimson moonlight and terror and blood in her eyes, she had registered him primarily as force, presence, power, absolute authority made physical. She had seen his face but hadn't had capacity to look at it. Now she looked. He was not what the stories had led her to imagine. The stories about the Alpha King were built almost entirely from the perspective of people who feared him. They emphasized force, dominance, the weight of his aura, what he had done to those who challenged him. They described him in the vocabulary of threat assessment. The stories were accurate, she didn't doubt that, but they had omitted something visible in the morning light when he was reading and hadn't noticed her yet. They had omitted the fact that he looked tired, not weak. Nothing suggested weakness, but there was something around his eyes, a depth of tiredness that wasn't physical, the specific exhaustion of someone who has carried an enormous weight for a very long time and has learned to do it so competently that nobody can see it is heavy. He was, she thought before she could stop the thought, a person. Obviously, he was a person. But knowing it abstractly and seeing it were different things, and the difference made something shift in her chest. That same resonance she had felt in the forest, that warmth against her ribs that had no explanation and no precedent in her experience. He looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. His expression moved through several things quickly. The sharp focus of someone recalled from somewhere else, and then something that settled into the lines of his face, with a quality that wasn't quite relief but lived in its neighborhood. "You're awake," he said. His voice was different here, still deep, still carrying that quality she had felt in the forest as a physical vibration, but without the aura's weight behind it. Just a voice, controlled and quiet, directed at her with a directness she wasn't accustomed to. Most people who spoke to her either looked past her or through her. He was looking directly at her, with the specific quality of attention that said, "You are what I am looking at, and I am not simultaneously thinking about something else." "Yes," she said. Her voice came out rougher than intended, scraped dry by cold and screaming and 18 years of being careful about when she used it. She sat up slowly, and he didn't move to help her, which she appreciated. She had experienced help that was control-wearing helpfulness, as a coat often enough to know the difference. And his stillness felt like respect rather than indifference. Her head protested the change in elevation. She pressed her fingers to her temple. "The wound has been dressed," he said. "Soren expects it to heal cleanly. You'll have a scar." "I have others," she said before she could decide whether to say it. Something moved in his expression. Not pity. She knew pity intimately, had extensive experience with its texture. Something more complicated and more controlled. He looked down at the document, folded it once, and set it aside. "Yes," he said. "I know." The two words landed with unexpected weight, not because they were heavy in themselves, but because of what lived underneath them. The implication that he had looked, catalogued, and understood what he was reading, that the story written on her skin had been read by someone who hadn't looked away. She didn't know what to do with that. The days that followed had a quality she had no framework for. She had experienced the full spectrum of how people with power treated those without it. Garrick's calibrated contempt, communicating value through its precise absence. Vane's careless brutality, almost impersonal in its efficiency. She had never been the target of his anger specifically, just available, which was in some ways worse. Calith's skilled cruelty, which required attention to inflict and therefore paradoxically communicated that she was worth noticing, even as the message was her worthlessness. She did not know this. She did not know what it felt like to be in a space where nothing was waiting to be weaponized. Soren came each morning to check the wound with thoroughness that was professional rather than invasive. Junior healers brought meals without commentary. The guards outside the eastern chamber were present but unobtrusive. People performing a function rather than delivering a message about her status. And Valerius came in the evenings. Not every evening. He was a king, and kings carried the endless administrative weight of being responsible for an entire civilization. She understood this without being told, but often enough that she began to expect it, and then to notice the texture of days differently depending on whether he appeared. He never announced himself. He simply arrived, usually with something, a report he was working through, a map he was studying, once a volume from the lower archive he set on the table without explanation, and which he spent 3 hours reading after he left. He would sit and work, and she would exist in the same room, and slowly the quality of his company began to alter how she experienced being alive. He talked to her. Not about what she was. Not about the silver veins or Soren's examination, or the significant deferred topic she could sense beneath the surface of their conversations. He talked about things directly in front of them. The map on the table, the border disputes of 3 decades ago. A pack leader in the Eastern reaches testing treaty boundaries for years. The archive volume. What she had found in it, whether the historical account of the first consolidations matched her expectations, what she thought of the 3rd chapter's argument. She answered carefully at first, the minimum required, waiting for the place where the conversation would reveal its actual purpose. It didn't reveal one. He asked what she thought, she told him. He listened with the full attention of someone genuinely interested in the answer. They disagreed twice. She had strong opinions about the 3rd chapter, which she felt was historically selective in ways that served its conclusion rather than following the evidence. And he didn't manage the disagreement or redirect it. He engaged with it. "You've read more history than I'd expect," he said one evening. "An Omega named Bryn kept a hidden collection," she said. "When I was young. History mostly. Some natural philosophy. A volume of pre-territorial lore I read until the binding came apart." Something shifted in his expression. "What did you make of it?" "I thought most of it was myth," she said. Constructed retrospectively to explain things early packs had no other framework for. She looked at her hands. The silver veins were faint but present at her wrists. "I'm less certain of that now." He looked at her hands, too. The silence between them had a different quality from the careful silences of earlier in the week. Fuller, holding more. "Evadne," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She didn't know when she had told it to him. Soren must have. But hearing it in his voice, in that room, in that quality of evening light, produced something in her chest she was not prepared for. "There are things I need to tell you," he said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready," she said immediately. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape a face makes when it is trying not to and failing slightly. "You've been in that pack for 18 years, he said. "You don't have to be ready for everything at once." She looked at him, at the tiredness around his eyes and the controlled expression, and the thing underneath the control she had been slowly learning to read over a week of evenings in this room. "What if I want to be?" she said. The almost smile deepened fractionally. "Then we'll start tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, finish the 3rd chapter. I want to hear the rest of your argument." She looked down at the volume in her hands, and for the first time in 18 years, she laughed. It came out uncertain, rusty, slightly surprised at itself, like something stored in a cold place, unsure whether the temperature had genuinely changed. But it was real. Entirely, completely real. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. She would learn it later. But that evening, in the quiet eastern chamber, with the silver veins faint at her wrists, and the sound of her own laughter dissolving into the air of a room that had started improbably to feel like somewhere she might exist without apology, she simply let it be what it was. Garrick had not slept in 4 days. This was not unusual in itself. He had gone without sleep before, during territorial disputes, during the long winter of the eastern border conflict 15 years ago, during the 3 days after Sarah's death, when he sat in the empty pack hall and stared at the wall. He knew sleeplessness intimately, the way the world acquired an unreal quality at the edges after the second night, the way small sounds became irritating, the way your own thoughts began to feel less like thoughts and more like something being done to you. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of a man who understood with increasing and irrefutable clarity that he had made a mistake so catastrophic the mind kept returning to it not to solve it, but simply to stand before it. The way you stand before something enormous and try to make your perception correspond to what your eyes are actually reporting. He had made mistakes before. He was not a man who devoted significant energy to examining them. You did what the situation required, absorbed the consequences, adjusted your position, and continued. That was leadership. That was how packs survived. But this. The morning after the Blood Moon hunt, when Valerius's guard arrived and took him and Vane and Caliph back to Obsidian Ridge under what was technically called an investigative hold, but functioned in every practical sense as polite imprisonment, he had told himself it was manageable. A treaty violation? Yes. Serious? Yes. But explainable. She had been unshifted for 18 years. The evidence was documented across 3 separate shifting ceremonies. He had witnesses, the entire pack, the officiating elders, old Marin herself, who had administered all 3 ceremonies and signed the records personally. It would be fine. He stopped telling himself that approximately 6 hours later, when the first of Valerius's investigators arrived. They came quietly, which was worse than noise. Noise announced itself. Noise could be prepared for. The quiet arrival of 3 people who introduced themselves as members of the Alpha King's Historical and Investigative Division and began, without preamble, asking questions that were very specifically not about the Blood Moon hunt. They asked about Evadne's arrival at the pack, who had found her, under what circumstances, who had been present, what the examination of the infant had determined about her nature and potential. Garrick answered carefully, watching their faces for information about what they already knew. Finding nothing. They were professionally, maddeningly blank. He told the story he had always told. Found on the ridge. Human infant. Kept out of mercy. He used that word specifically, and one of the investigators wrote it down without expression. And something about watching it be written made the word feel different than it had in his mouth. They asked about the shifting ceremonies. He told them about all 3. The procedures, the results, the documentation. He referenced old Marin. He referenced the elders. He was thorough and accurate, and presenting, he felt, a genuinely solid case. They thanked him and left. 2 hours later, they returned and asked which members of the Elder Council had been present when the infant was first brought to the territory. Garrick felt the first real cold move through his chest. He gave them the names. Calith heard about the investigators from Vane, who had heard from a packmate who had seen them enter the Elder Quarter. She went very still when he told her. This was not her usual response to bad news. Her usual response was rapid, fluent reorganization, the ability to assess a problem quickly, identify available solutions, and begin moving toward the most efficient one before most people had finished processing the problem itself. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was the thing she relied on most. But standing in the narrow corridor between the pack hall and the Elder Quarter, listening to Vane describe investigators asking questions about the beginning, not about the hunt, about the beginning, she felt that rapid reorganization simply failed to start, because there was no efficient solution. She had understood this at some level since the moment in the clearing when the light erupted from Evadne's chest. Or perhaps before that. Perhaps since the Alpha King's aura flattened every wolf except the girl bleeding against the tree. She had pushed the understanding down because she was good at pushing things down, but it had been there. They had made a mistake. Not a small one. Not a mistake that could be explained or contextualized or buried under sufficient documentation. A mistake of the category that didn't have solutions. Only damage control. And damage control that was already operating at a significant disadvantage because Valerius had the girl and had been in that clearing and had seen the light. "We need to talk to the elders," Calith said. Vane looked at her. "The investigators are already—" "Before the investigators get to them," Calith said. "We need to talk to the elders first." Elder Cora was 73 years old and had been a member of the Obsidian Ridge Elder Council for 41 of those years. She had administered ceremonies, settled disputes, maintained the pack's ritual calendar, and served as the institutional memory of a community that, like all communities, preferred its institutional memory to support its current version of events. She had also, 27 years ago, been the eldest council member present on the night a human infant was brought in from the northern ridge. She had been the one to examine it, not the way an ordinary wolf examined an ordinary infant, basic triage of a foundling determining viability. She had examined it with the complete focused attention of a woman who had spent 40 years studying the pre-territorial texts and who recognized, in the faint luminosity of the infant's skin and the specific quality of its stillness, something her scholarly knowledge identified immediately, and her practical instincts told her to say nothing about. She had said nothing. For 27 years, this had not been a simple decision. It had been the most complex of her life, made in approximately 30 seconds, while holding a 3-day-old infant in a cold corridor with Garrick standing 10 feet away, waiting for her assessment. She had looked at the baby. She had looked at Garrick. She had looked at the baby again, and she had said, "Human, no wolf, survivable, if kept warm." She had spent 27 years telling herself she had made the right choice. She was significantly less certain now. Calith arrived at her door at mid-morning, which Cora had been expecting since she heard about the investigators. She let her in, because refusing would have been a statement, and Cora was not ready to make statements yet. "You know why I'm here?" Calith said. "Yes," Cora said. "The investigators are going to speak to you." "Yes," Cora said. Calith looked at her with the direct, assessing quality that had always distinguished her, that cold, focused intelligence that could have been remarkable in different circumstances. "When they do," she said, "what are you going to tell them?" Cora looked at her for a long moment. "The truth," she said. Something moved behind Calith's eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had come expecting one conversation and found a different one. Cora, she said, think carefully about what that means. For you, for the council members who were there that night. For the pack, you've been part of this for 27 years. The investigators won't distinguish between people who acted and people who knew and said nothing. If this comes apart, it comes apart for everyone. I know, Cora said. Then, I said I know, Cora repeated quietly. I didn't say it changed my answer. Kalith left. Cora sat by the window and looked at her hands for a long time. Then she sent a message to the Alpha King's investigators requesting an immediate meeting. Vane found the empty shelf in the administrative archive that same afternoon. He had kept the suppression records there for years, under a classification heading that made them look like routine medicinal documentation. He had told himself this was adequate concealment. Who examined routine medicinal records? The Alpha King's Historical and Investigative Division examined routine medicinal records. He stood in front of the empty shelf for a long time. Then he went to find Garrick. Garrick was in the Alpha's study, the room where 43 years of territorial leadership had been conducted. He was standing at the window in the posture Vane had seen 100 times, upright, composed, the bearing of a man who had never allowed himself to appear anything other than in control. He looked at Vane's face when he entered. They have the records, Vane said. All of them? Yes. Silence. Cora? Garrick said. Vane nodded. Garrick turned back to the window. Outside, the Obsidian Ridge territory spread in the autumn morning. The pack houses, the training yards, the ceremonial valley where 3 shifting ceremonies had been performed for a girl they had told themselves was broken. 43 years of his life. Everything he had built and held and controlled for so long, he had stopped thinking of it as something that could be taken away. How much do they have? He said. Enough, Vane said. Garrick's jaw tightened. Then we have very little time, he said quietly. And we are going to need to be very, very careful about what we do with it. Outside, the morning continued with complete indifference. The same morning that was reaching, several hours to the south, through the window of the eastern chamber, where the girl they had spent 27 years suppressing was reading a volume of pre-territorial lore and laughing for the first time in her life. The scholar's name was Aldrich Voss. He had never been part of Obsidian Ridge, never lived there, never held a position in the pack, never attended a ceremony or performed any of the ordinary functions of pack membership. He had existed in relation to Obsidian Ridge as a purely transactional presence, a man with specific, rare expertise who had been contacted through back channels, compensated generously, and systematically removed from the official record of everything that followed. Valerius's investigators found him in 4 days. He was living in a small house at the edge of a market town 3 territories east, under a name that wasn't his, conducting a modest trade in legitimate herbal compounds. He was 61 years old, and when the investigators knocked at dawn and presented the Alpha King's seal, he looked at it for a long moment and stepped back and let them in without a word. He had been waiting, Soren thought, reading the interview transcript later. Not with dread, with something closer to relief. The transcript was 12 pages long. Valerius read it alone in the Eastern Tower in the hour before his evening visit to Evadne. He read it once quickly, establishing its shape, then slowly, stopping at specific passages, rereading sentences that required the deliberate processing you gave to things the mind initially refused to absorb. He set it down after the second reading. Sat with it, then picked it up and read the central section a 3rd time, because even after 2 complete readings, part of him was still insisting, with the stubborn irrationality of a mind confronting something it would prefer not to be true, that he had misunderstood. He had not misunderstood. The working had been designed before Evadne was born. This was the first thing the transcript established, and it sat heaviest. Not a reactive measure. Not something improvised when the infant arrived and someone recognized what she was, and made a panicked decision. A premeditated construction. Planned, commissioned, and prepared in advance. Which meant someone had known the child was coming before she arrived. Aldrich Voss had been contacted 14 months before the infant appeared on the northern ridge. The commission had been specific. Design a suppression working capable of containing a lichen protectress bloodline from birth, maintainable indefinitely with periodic renewal, and undetectable by standard examination. He had considered refusing. He said this in the transcript without apparent expectation that it would mitigate anything, in the tone of a man who had already had the internal argument about whether it counted for anything and reached an unsatisfying conclusion. The working required was at the absolute boundary of what was ethically permissible in the old scholarly tradition, which drew a hard line at workings designed to suppress rather than contain, the distinction being that containment addressed dangerous power existing in an active state, while suppression addressed power that had not yet manifested, the magical equivalent of punishing intent. But the compensation had been significant. The client had been persuasive, and he had told himself that a lichen protectress bloodline appearing in an uncontrolled environment, in a pack with no knowledge or tradition for handling that magnitude of power, might genuinely cause harm if left unmanaged. He had told himself it was protective. He had designed the working. The mechanics occupied the transcript's middle section, and they were, Soren noted in his marginal annotations when Valerius shared the document, extraordinarily sophisticated. Not brutal. That was both technically impressive and deeply disturbing. A brutal suppression would have been simpler and left evidence. This was precise. The work of someone who understood not just how to block power, but how to make the block invisible. How to integrate it so completely with the subject's developing biology that her body came to experience the suppression as its own natural state. Her wolf hadn't been locked away. It had been taught, from birth, that it didn't exist. Every reaching she had done in those 3 shifting ceremonies, every attempt to find the animal inside her and come up empty, hadn't been her failing to locate something absent. It had been her finding the suppression and experiencing it as absence. The working had been designed to present itself as a void, as a genuine constitutional lack, rather than an imposed constraint. She hadn't failed to shift. She had been reaching into a mirror designed to show her nothing, every time, regardless of what was actually there. Soren put the transcript down and pressed his fingers to his eyes. The renewal records were the 3rd section. This was where Vane appeared, and where the transcript acquired a quality of methodical, almost administrative horror that Soren found in some ways worse than the dramatic elements. The renewal of the suppression working, required every 18 months according to Voss's design specifications to prevent natural deterioration of the seal, had not been conducted through any dramatic ritual. It had been built into the ordinary fabric of Evadne's life. The compounds required for renewal were contact-based, absorbed through the skin over time, delivered through objects Evadne handled regularly. Her sleeping pallet, resealed on a schedule. The soap used in the pack's washing facilities, formulated with the renewal compound and replaced at intervals. 2 of the serving vessels she used daily in the kitchen. Ordinary objects, handled without awareness. The kind of things that existed in the background of a life, noticed only in their absence. Vane had managed the logistics. He had received compounds from Voss's intermediary on a regular schedule for 18 years, administered the renewals with the quiet efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance, and kept the records in the administrative archive under a medicinal classification heading. Soren sat with this for a long time. The sheer sustained investment of energy and resource and coordination required to maintain this working for 18 years, to keep Voss supplied and compensated, to manage the renewal schedule, to ensure the compounds reached the right objects without anyone noticing. Someone had wanted this very badly, badly enough to maintain it for 18 years which meant the original motivation had not diminished. Because you didn't maintain a working of this complexity and cost for nearly 2 decades out of habit. You maintained it because the thing you were suppressing still frightened you. Kayleith's section was brief. She had not been involved in the original commission or the design or the logistics. She had been 4 years old when the working was first applied. What she had contributed over the years was the social enforcement, the sustained, skilled work of ensuring Evadne remained isolated, that no attachment formed that might accidentally trigger a fracture in the seal, that the pack's collective perception of her stayed fixed at defect, which was the perception the working required to function optimally. Voss had specified this in his design notes. The suppression worked best in an environment of consistent invalidation. Belief in Wolfkind was not purely psychological. It interacted with the magical substrate, and a subject consistently told by every social signal available that she was without power would unconsciously reinforce the suppression from the inside. The external working and the internal belief would become mutually sustaining. Kayleith hadn't known the technical reasoning, but someone had told her early that keeping Evadne small and isolated and certain of her own worthlessness was important, and she had been very, very good at it. Valerius was at the window of the eastern tower when Sorin finished reading. The sun was going down. Late afternoon light fell across the room in long horizontal bars, doing nothing to address the cold that had settled in Sorin's chest somewhere around the 3rd page. "The original client," Sorin said. "The intermediary. Voss doesn't know who commissioned it." "We're pursuing it," Valerius said. His voice was very flat. "If someone commissioned this before she was born." "I know what it means," Valerius said. Sorin was quiet. "Someone knew she was coming," Valerius continued, still facing the window. "Knew what she was, and decided before she took her first breath that she needed to be buried." He paused. "That is not a pack politics decision. That is not a territorial calculation. That is someone who understood the prophecy and made a choice about it." Sorin thought about the prophetic appendix, the passage he had read aloud in this same room days ago that had changed the quality of the silence. "Then whoever commissioned it is still out there," Sorin said. "And they've just lost 18 years of work." The words landed in the room and stayed there. At that precise moment, 3 floors below, in the eastern chamber where Evadne sat at the table near the window with a volume open in her lap, the silver veins at her wrists flared. Not the faint rhythmic pulse they had maintained since her arrival. A real flare. Sudden, bright, lasting 3 full seconds before subsiding. She looked down at her wrists with an expression that Sorin, passing the corridor outside and seeing it through the gap in the door, would later describe as not frightened. Curious. The seal was cracking. Not breaking? Not yet. The working was too well constructed for a single flare to dissolve it. But the distance from Obsidian Ridge, the absence of the renewal compounds, the proximity to her mate, and the slowly growing safety of her environment were doing what 18 years of her own efforts had never been permitted to do. They were giving her wolf room to breathe. And her wolf, Sorin thought, watching the silver fade back to its faint pulse, and hearing from the corridor the sound of Valerius's footsteps beginning their evening descent toward the eastern chamber. Her wolf had been waiting a very long time. The poison arrived on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not announced. It arrived the way the most dangerous things always arrived, quietly, embedded in something ordinary, wearing the face of something that belonged. A food delivery to the Eastern Tower. Standard provisions, sourced from the Stronghold's main kitchens, carried up by a junior staff member who had worked there for 3 years and whose background had been thoroughly checked when he was hired and not checked again since, because that was the nature of trust once established. It became invisible, and invisible things were not examined. The staff member's name was Aldous. He had been placed 14 months ago by an intermediary whose name Valerius's investigators were still pursuing. The poison was in the dried herbs packed into the bottom of the provision basket, beneath the bread and sealed containers of broth and the small package of writing materials Evadne had requested 2 days earlier. Contact-based, like the renewal compounds, designed to be absorbed gradually, producing effects that would initially present as ordinary illness before progressing into something that wouldn't. It would have worked if Soren hadn't inspected the basket. He inspected it not from suspicion, but from the professional caution of a healer who had read a 12-page transcript about compounds delivered through ordinary objects and had quietly adjusted his behavior accordingly. He recognized the herb blend in the bottom immediately. Not the individual components, which were separated and mixed with innocuous filler, but the combined scent beneath the filler, which triggered a recognition in the part of his memory that stored dangerous things. He had Aldous detained within the hour. Aldous said nothing useful. He had been given the basket by a man in the market district, paid in advance, told only that the delivery needed to reach the eastern tower without passing through standard kitchen inspection. He had not known what was in the herbs. Whether this was true, Soren couldn't determine. It didn't particularly matter. What mattered was that someone outside the stronghold knew exactly where Evadne was, and had moved within a week of her arrival. Soren told Valerius. Valerius moved Evadne to different quarters within the hour. He didn't tell her why, and she didn't ask. She had spent 18 years reading urgency in the people around her and responding without requiring explanation. She gathered the volume she had been reading and the writing materials and followed the guard to the new room without comment. That night, she asked Valerius directly. He told her the truth. She sat with it for a long moment, hands flat on the table, her expression doing the thing it did when processing. That particular stillness. Not shock, but absorption, taking the shape of new information and fitting it against everything she already held. "It wasn't just Garrick," she said. "No," he said. "Someone commissioned the suppression before I was born." "Yes." "They know it's failing," she said. Not a question. "They know you survived the hunt," Valerius said carefully. "They know you're here. They know the seal is deteriorating. And they've demonstrated reach inside this stronghold, which means we don't yet know the full extent of what we're dealing with." She looked at him steadily. "And what are you doing about it?" "Everything," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and looked back at the table. He stayed another hour. Neither spoke much. But when he left, he stood outside her door for a long moment before walking away. And the guard stationed there noted in his shift report that the Alpha King had checked the lock twice. The second attempt came 6 days later, and it was not subtle. 3 men entered the stronghold through the service tunnels on the north side, a route unused operationally for decades, appearing on no current map of the building. They knew exactly where it was. They knew exactly where it led. They moved through the tunnels with the confidence of people working from recent, accurate intelligence. They were not conventional assassins. They carried no weapons designed for quick, clean killing. They carried extraction equipment, restraints, sedatives calibrated for a wolf of Evadne's size and estimated power output, and a containment vessel that Soren, examining it afterward, identified as designed specifically for suppressing active, magical signatures during transport. They had not come to kill her. They had come to take her back. The guard rotation outside Evadne's new quarters had been doubled since the poison attempt. 2 of the 4 guards on duty that night were members of Valerius's personal detail, experienced, decorated, entirely unconnected to the stronghold's ordinary staff networks. They heard the men in the tunnel 40 seconds before they emerged, and by the time the extraction team came through the access point, they were already waiting. The fight was brief. 2 of the 3 men were restrained. The third escaped back into the tunnel and was not caught before reaching the exit point, which meant whoever was directing this received a report before dawn. Evadne had been awake when it happened. She heard the sounds, muffled, contained, but present, and had not hidden. She positioned herself near the door with the heaviest object in the room, a solid iron candle holder, held with the calm practicality of someone who had spent 18 years making do with whatever was available. When Valerius arrived 3 minutes after the guards sent the alert, he found her standing upright in the center of the room, not trembling, watching the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The candle holder," he said after a moment. "It was the heaviest thing," she said. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anguish and was somehow both simultaneously. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stood in front of her, and she let the candle holder drop to her side, and for a moment neither of them did anything, just stood in the aftermath, the cold clarity that follows the receding edge of danger, breathing the same air. His hand came up, stopped just short of her face. She watched him make the decision, visible for once in the set of his jaw, to take the distance back rather than close it. His hand dropped. "We need to move you again," he said. "I know," she said. "Outside the stronghold," he said. "Somewhere the intelligence network they've built inside these walls doesn't reach." She looked at him steadily. "You know where." "Yes." "Then let's go," she said. They rode out before dawn. A small party, Valerius, 4 personal guards, Soren and Evadne, moving through the darkness with the purposeful quiet of people who understood the importance of unremarkable exits. No torches, no announcements. The gate guard on duty had been personally briefed and would report, to anyone who asked, that the Eastern Tower's occupant remained in residence. Evadne rode beside Valerius. She had not ridden much. Horses had not been a significant feature of pack life in Obsidian Ridge, where wolves covered territory on 4 legs. But she managed with the quiet competence she brought to most physical challenges, and she didn't complain about the pace, or the cold, or the darkness. In the second hour, when the stronghold was far enough behind them that the quality of the night had shifted from departure to transit, she said, "The person who commissioned the suppression." "Yes," Valerius said. "They knew what I was before I was born." "Yes." "Which means they knew about the prophecy." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "You haven't told me what it says," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. He rode beside her for a long moment without answering. "No," he said finally. "I haven't." She absorbed this. The darkness moved around them, the horse's breath visible in the cold air. Stars conducting their ancient, indifferent work overhead. "When you're ready to," she said quietly. "I'll be ready to hear it." He looked at her. She could feel the quality of his attention even in the dark, that focused, complete directedness she had been learning the texture of over 10 days of evenings in a room that had started to feel like safety. He said nothing, but his horse moved fractionally closer to hers and stayed there for the rest of the ride through the dark. The seal broke at dawn, not from anything external, not from the changed location or the cold air or the motion of riding, from something internal, the cumulative weight of distance from the renewal compounds, the growing safety of her environment, and the specific sustained proximity of the man riding beside her, whose presence her body had been recognizing with increasing urgency for 10 days, and whose closeness in the open air beyond the stronghold, finally, tipped the accumulated pressure past the threshold the seal could hold. It didn't feel like breaking. It felt like something pressed flat for so long it had forgotten. It had a shape suddenly, in the gray pre-dawn light, beginning to remember. Evadne pulled her horse to a stop. Valeria stopped immediately beside her. She had her hand pressed to her sternum. Not in pain, that was the thing. It wasn't pain. It was the absence of a specific quality of nothing she had carried so long she had classified it as normal. The seal didn't break with violence. It dissolved quietly, like ice in moving water. And what remained underneath was her. Just her. But complete. The silver light didn't come yet. The celestial form didn't rise. The catastrophic power the pre-territorial texts described was still several layers beneath the surface, still waking, still orienting itself after 18 years of imposed sleep. But something was awake that hadn't been before, and it turned with the unerring instinct of something that has always known exactly what it was looking for, toward the man sitting on horseback beside her in the gray dawn. She looked at him. His expression in the early light was completely unguarded. "It broke," she said. "I know," he said. "I can feel it." She looked at him a moment longer. The thing in her chest, awake now, present, oriented, pressed warmly against her ribs. "What happens next?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Everything," he said quietly. And somewhere deep inside her, something ancient and enormous and entirely devastatingly hers began at last to rise. It began with the ground, not with light, not with sound, not with any of the dramatic forewarnings that pre-territorial texts described in their accounts of great power manifesting. It began with the ground beneath Evadne's feet, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, as though the earth had registered something changing above it and was adjusting its position in response. The grass around her boots flattened outward in a slow, perfect circle. The frost on nearby stones melted in the same pattern, retreating from her in concentric rings. Valerius felt it through his horse before he saw it. The animal went absolutely still, not frightened still, not the rigid whites of the eyes stillness of a horse encountering a predator, but the deep instinctive stillness of a creature that has registered something so far above its category of experience that its ordinary responses simply don't apply. The four guards behind them did the same, their horses arresting mid-step, every animal in the party locked in the same suspended attentiveness. Evadne was standing in the frost-ringed grass, with her hand still pressed to her sternum. Her eyes were closed. "Evadne," Valerius said. She didn't answer. Not because she couldn't hear him, because the part of her that had learned to respond to her own name was currently occupied with something that required everything she had. Every fragment of attention, every gram of conscious will, every piece of the self that 18 years of suppression had compressed into a smaller and smaller space, and that was now, in the gray pre-dawn light of an open field, being asked to expand back into the full volume of what it had always been. It was not comfortable. It was not painful either, not the way the physical transformation of a standard wolf shift was painful, not the bone-cracking renegotiation of form that Wolfkind experienced in first shifts and learned to integrate over years of practice. This was different. This was the specific, overwhelming sensation of a thing that had been described to her abstractly as power becoming experientially real, becoming not a concept but a fact, immediate and physical and enormous, pressing outward from the center of her chest in every direction simultaneously. She had a wolf. She had always had a wolf. The knowing of it. Not the intellectual knowing of Valerius's words in a room 10 days ago, not the scholarly knowing of Soren's careful explanations, but the direct, unmediated, bone-deep knowing of a woman standing in a field with 18 years of false absence dissolving around her like morning fog, hit her with a force that staggered her. She took one step backward. Then the light came. It didn't erupt. Later, the guards would describe it differently to different people. Marin, the eldest, would use that word specifically, because that was what his body had experienced. But Valerius, watching from 6 feet away, with the full attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for this with a patience that had cost him considerably, would always describe it differently. It unfolded, like something folded very small for a very long time, now in the absence of the constraint that had kept it compressed, simply returning to its natural state. Silver light emerging from Evadne's chest and moving outward through her skin. Not replacing her, not consuming her, but illuminating her from within the way a lantern illuminates the room around it, revealing rather than obscuring the thing at its center. The silver veins, invisible for days, blazed back to full visibility. Every one of them, not just the traceries at her wrists and temple. Every vein in her body, lit silver white, visible through her skin, mapping the entire circulatory architecture of her in a pattern that pulsed in synchrony with her heartbeat. She was incandescent. She was luminous. She was standing in a frost-circled field in the gray dawn, looking like something the pre-dawn dark had been specifically arranged as a backdrop to reveal. The guards had dismounted without being aware of doing so. They were on their knees. Not from the sovereign pressure. Valerius hadn't released the aura, and even if he had, the aura didn't produce this specific quality of response, this instinctive, total prostration that bypassed the chain of command entirely and went straight to whatever lived underneath rank and training and 20 years of professional conditioning. This was something older. The response of wolf nature encountering something it recognized from before memory, from the cellular level, from the part of Wolfkin's inheritance that predated the pack structure and every institution built on top of it. Recognition. The light reached its full intensity and held, and in the held brightness, the form began to emerge. It rose from behind her. Not from her, not replacing her physical form the way a standard shift replaced human form with wolf, but from behind her, rising up through the light as though it had been there all along, waiting just behind the visible surface of things. For the moment, the barrier between its existence and the world's capacity to perceive it finally dissolved. The celestial wolf was enormous. Not wolf enormous. Not the impressive size of a dominant alpha in full shift. Not even the exceptional size of the largest wolves in historical record. This was a different category of scale entirely, the kind the eye took a moment to correctly process because the brain kept trying to impose familiar reference points and finding none that applied. It rose above Evadne's standing form and kept rising, its head clearing the tree line at the field's edge with room to spare, its body composed not of fur and muscle and bone, but of something the guards' later testimonies struggled consistently to describe. Light. Mist. Starlight. The texture of it shifted as it moved, sometimes appearing almost solid, almost physically present, the luminous white of deep winter snow. Then the angle would change, and it would become translucent, the trees behind it visible through the substance of it, assembled from the material that existed between stars. Then it would move again and be both simultaneously, solid and transparent, present and ancient, real in a way that made everything around it seem by comparison slightly approximate. Its eyes were gold, not wolf gold, not the amber yellow of a predator's nighttime eyes. Gold like light at the center of a flame, gold like metal heated past the point of reflecting light and begun to generate it. Twin suns, burning steady and calm above Evadne's luminous form, oriented forward with an intelligence that was immediately, unmistakably present. It looked at Valerius. He did not kneel, not from stubbornness, not from the reflexive resistance of a dominant wolf encountering superior force. He didn't kneel because the thing looking at him out of those burning gold eyes was not asking him to. It was looking at him with the specific, complete attention of something that has been searching for a very long time and has just, at last, found what it was looking for. He took one step forward. The celestial wolf lowered its massive head, not in submission, in recognition. The gesture of one ancient thing acknowledging another, two forms of power that were not competing but complementary, finding their relative positions not through dominance, but through the older, quieter language of what belonged together. The sound it made was not a growl and not a howl, and not any vocalization in the standard taxonomy of wolf communication. It was a sound from before taxonomy existed. It moved through the field and into the tree line, and up into the gray sky, and outward in all directions at once, and every wolf within range, every wolf for miles in every direction, sleeping in pack halls and running pre-dawn territory checks and sitting in guard posts, felt it in the place where their wolf lived, in the deepest, oldest part of what they were, and knew. In the stronghold 3 hours' ride south, the morning kitchen staff reported simultaneously that every piece of iron in the building vibrated for approximately 4 seconds at dawn. In the elder quarter of Obsidian Ridge, Elder Cora, awake since before dawn, sitting with the weight of a decision already made, felt something move through her chest that she would describe later to the investigators as the sound of something being corrected. In a house in the market town, 3 territories east, Aldrich Voss woke with tears on his face and no memory of dreaming. And in the field, as the sound finished moving through the world and the light began slowly to shift, not fading but settling, drawing back toward Evadne's form and integrating rather than dissipating, the celestial wolf not disappearing but folding back into the woman who carried it, returning to the interior with the calm deliberateness of something that had simply needed to establish its existence and was now content to wait. Evadne opened her eyes. They were gold, not permanently. As the light continued settling, they shifted back to the dark brown she had looked at in still water her whole life. But for a moment, as the lichen protectress completed its return, they burned. She looked at Valerius. He was 3 feet away. He had crossed the distance while the form was still emerging, moving toward her with the same focused inevitability he brought to everything, close enough that she could see his expression clearly in the growing dawn light. She had learned his face over 10 days of evenings. She had never seen it look like this. "It's real," she said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness surprised her. "It has always been real," he said. She looked down at her hands. The silver veins had settled to their faint, rhythmic pulse. Her hands looked like hands. They felt like hands. They felt, for the first time, like hers. "The prophecy," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's time." Behind them, the 4 guards were still on their knees in the frost-ringed grass, and the sun was coming up, and the kingdom that had just felt something move through it without knowing what it was would not remain unknowing for long. Everything was about to change. The only question was the order in which it changed.
The prophecy was 7 lines long. This was the first thing that struck Evadne when Valerius finally read it to her. Not its content, not immediately, but its brevity. She had been imagining something expansive, something that filled pages, the kind of elaborate prophetic text that the pre-territorial volumes she had read were full of, layered, elusive, requiring scholarly apparatus to decode. 7 lines felt insufficient for the weight that had been building around it. Then he read it, and she understood that 7 lines was enough. They were sitting in the shelter of a tree line at the field's edge, the horses grazing at a distance, the 4 guards positioned far enough away to be present without being proximate. Sorin had produced the pre-territorial volume from his pack. He had brought it, Evadne noted, which meant he had known this conversation was coming. And he held it open while Valerius read aloud from the prophetic appendix in the careful, measured cadence of someone who had read the passage many times and was still not entirely accustomed to it. When the last blood of the first line walks living in the world, she will carry the protectress, and the protectress will carry the dawn. Suppressed she will suffer, found she will wake. Her mate will be the anchor, and the anchor will hold. The false order breaks at her rising. The old order returns at her crowning. What was unmade will be made. What was silent will speak. Silence. Evadne looked at the page. At the 7 lines in their archaic script, the ink faded to brown at the edges. The letters formed in the careful hand of someone writing down something they had received orally and were afraid of misremembering. The last blood of the first line, she said. The first alpha bloodline, Valerius said, before the territorial consolidation, before the pack system as it currently exists. There was a founding lineage. The historical record calls them the first wolves, though the scholars argue about whether that's literal or honorific. The lichen protectress form originated in that bloodline. He paused. The lineage was believed to have died out 9 centuries ago. There were no confirmed living descendants. Until me, she said. Until you. She looked at the frost-ringed grass beyond the tree line, still marked by the circle the awakening had pressed into it. Someone knew, she said. Before I was born, the person who commissioned the suppression, they knew I was coming, and they knew what I was. Yes. Which means they knew about this prophecy. She looked at the page again. The false order breaks at her rising. They knew what my existence meant for the current structure. The territorial system as it stands, Valerius said carefully, was built on the premise that the first wolf bloodline was extinct. The Alpha King's authority derives from a consolidation of power that was justified, historically, by the absence of the original line. He met her eyes. Your existence doesn't just complicate that justification, it supersedes it. She absorbed this. I'm not here to take your throne, she said. I know that, he said. That's not what the prophecy describes. Read the 4th line. She looked at it. Her mate will be the anchor, and the anchor will hold. She was quiet for a moment. The false order, she said, moving past it deliberately, her voice steady. What does that mean specifically? Sorin spoke for the first time. The scholars who annotated the prophetic appendix interpreted it as referring to any power structure built on the suppression of the original bloodline. Not just politically, magically. The territorial boundaries themselves were drawn using a system that assumed the lichen protectress form was gone. The wards, the treaty magics, the boundary workings. He paused. They have a flaw built into them. A foundational instability that the original architects knew about and believed was permanently resolved by the bloodline's extinction. And now the bloodline isn't extinct, Evadne said. Now the bloodline isn't extinct, Sorin confirmed. She looked at her hands, the silver veins, faint and rhythmic. So whoever commissioned the suppression wasn't just trying to control me. They were trying to maintain a system that my existence destabilizes. Yes, Valerius said, which means they have significantly more at stake than personal motivation, and significantly more resources than a single bad actor with a grudge. The weight of it settled across the morning. The records had been assembled by Sorin over the 10 days since her arrival. Not just the pre-territorial volume, but a collection of cross-referenced texts, correspondence from 3 different archival sources, and the annotated interview transcript from Aldrich Voss. He spread them across the flat surface of a saddlebag on the ground between them, organized in the order he had compiled them, and walked her through what they collectively established: her bloodline. The first wolf line had not died cleanly. The historical record's confidence in its extinction was, Soren explained, based on a deliberate falsification. A set of records altered approximately 9 centuries ago that removed 3 surviving members of the line from the documented genealogy and reclassified them as having died in the territorial wars. 2 of them had died. 1 had not. The line had continued, quietly, underground, moving through generations that didn't know what they carried, the Lycan Protectress power dormant in each of them. Dormant not because of suppression, but because the form only manifested fully in 1 generation per century, when the bloodline's accumulated power reached sufficient concentration. 9 centuries of quiet inheritance, building toward the moment when the concentration finally reached the threshold, building toward her. She was not simply a wolf with an unusual form. She was the terminal point of 9 centuries of patient accumulation. The generation in which everything the bloodline had been carrying finally arrived at its full expression. The Lycan Protectress hadn't been dormant in her ancestors because they were weak. It had been dormant because she was where it was going. "The dreams," she said. Soren looked at her. "I've had them since I was 15. Running. A silver landscape. A howl that felt like memory." She looked at the records. That was the form, trying to surface. "Yes," Soren said quietly, "the suppression couldn't reach the dream state. What you were experiencing was the Lycan Protectress finding the only space available to it." She thought about 15-year-old Evadne, waking up crying from dreams that felt like something lost, telling herself it was imagination, filing it away in the category of things she was not allowed to have. She thought about the version of herself who had stood at the base of the oak tree in the forest and closed her eyes and waited for the end. She thought about what it meant that neither of those versions of her had known what she was carrying. When Soren finished, she sat in silence for a while, not processing. She had been processing since the first silver flare, since the dawn in the field, since the celestial form had risen and the sound had moved through the world, and her eyes had burned gold for 30 seconds in the frost-ringed grass. The processing was largely complete. What she was doing now was something different. She was sitting with the specific, private weight of understanding that the life she had lived, every year of it, every day of it, every small cruelty and sustained absence and careful, determined survival, had not been the accident she had always understood it as. It had been engineered, deliberately, specifically, by people who had known exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway. She had not been broken. She had been buried. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and she sat with it until it settled into its correct position in the architecture of how she understood herself. Then she looked up at Valerius. He had been watching her with the patient, complete attention she had come to recognize as his particular way of being present. Not filling silence, not managing her processing, simply being there with the full weight of his attention directed at her and the complete absence of any pressure about what she was supposed to do with it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Show me the 4th line again." He took the volume from Soren and held it out to her without comment. "Her mate will be the anchor, and the anchor will hold." She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, he was still watching her. He said nothing, but something in the set of his expression, in the careful, controlled stillness that she had spent 10 days learning to read, shifted fractionally, enough to be visible, enough to be, for the first time, deliberate. He reached forward. His hand covered hers where it rested on the open page. And then, with the slow, complete deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that is not impulsive, but has been, in one form or another, inevitable, since the moment he stepped into a clearing under a crimson moon and found the most important thing in his world bleeding against a tree. Valerius, Alpha King of all wolf territories, knelt, not in submission, in recognition. The morning held very still around them.
Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to Seraphina's romance stories if you stand with justice. The trial was held in the Valley of the First Accord. This was not a coincidence. The Valley of the First Accord was the oldest ceremonial site in the wolf territories, the wide, flat expanse of ancient ground where, 9 centuries ago, the territorial consolidation had been formalized and the current pack system had been declared into existence. It was used for exactly 2 categories of event, the installation of Alpha Kings and the dissolution of packs found to have violated the foundational laws of Wolfkind. Valerius had chosen it deliberately. The message was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. They came from every territory, not because they were required to. The trial was public, which meant attendance was permitted rather than compelled, and the journey to the valley was not short from most of the outer territories. They came because what had moved through the world at dawn 6 days ago had reached every wolf in every pack, and wolves who had felt something they couldn't explain in the deepest part of what they were, and had subsequently received word that the Alpha King had convened a dissolution trial at the Valley of the First Accord, were not, as a category, capable of staying home. By the morning of the trial, the valley held more wolves than it had seen assembled in living memory. They stood in the tiered natural formations that surrounded the flat central ground, the rocky outcroppings and grass-covered rises that formed a rough amphitheater around the ceremonial space. And they were, collectively, very quiet. Not the quiet of crowds waiting for entertainment. The quiet of people who understood they were present at something significant and were trying to be adequate to it. Evadne stood at Valerius's right. She had not asked to stand there. He had positioned himself beside her when they entered the valley, and the geometry of it had been natural rather than announced. She was simply where she was, and where she was happened to be, at the right hand of the Alpha King, and the assembled wolves who saw this adjusted their understanding of the situation accordingly. She was wearing the gray of a neutral party, not the white of an accused or the black of a mourner. Soren had suggested it. She had agreed without much investment in the question of clothing, which felt like the smallest of the day's components. Her silver veins were faint, as they had been since the dawn in the field. Her eyes were dark brown. She looked, she knew, entirely ordinary. She had decided this was fine. Garrick was brought in first. He was not restrained. The Alpha King's investigators had assessed him as unlikely to attempt flight. A correct assessment, Evadne thought, watching him enter the central ground with the careful, composed bearing of a man who had decided that dignity was the last available resource and was deploying it with everything he had. He was Alpha of Obsidian Ridge. He had been Alpha for 43 years. He walked like it, even here, even now. He looked at her once. She held his gaze without expression. He looked away first. Vane came next. He had not managed the same composure as Garrick. There was something around his eyes, a tight, controlled quality that betrayed the sustained effort of keeping his expression neutral. He was a man accustomed to operating from a position of physical dominance in situations where physical dominance was the relevant currency, and this was a situation where it was entirely irrelevant, and he hadn't fully adjusted to that. He didn't look at her at all. Calith was last. She entered the central ground with her chin level and her shoulders back, and her face arranged in the expression Evadne had spent 18 years watching her deploy. That perfect, polished composure. The one that communicated that whatever was happening was not, ultimately, something that touched her. She had worn that face through every cruelty, every calculation, every sustained act of careful social engineering. She wore it now. But when she took her position beside Garrick and Vane, and the full weight of the assembled valley settled on her, thousands of wolves from every territory, the pre-dawn quiet, the ceremonial ground, the Alpha King standing 15 feet away with an expression of absolute finality. A single fracture appeared in it. She was afraid. Evadne saw it because she knew that face better than anyone alive. She felt nothing in particular about it. Tradition testimonies took most of the morning. Elder Cora spoke first, in the careful, measured cadence of a woman who had prepared her words and was delivering them exactly as prepared, without embellishment and without omission. She described the night the infant arrived. She described her examination. She described what she had recognized and what she had said instead, and why. And she did not attempt to contextualize or excuse the decision. She stated it as a fact, accepted its weight, and sat down. The valley was very quiet during her testimony. Aldrich Voss spoke via written statement, read by one of Valerius's investigators, because Voss himself had requested not to be present in person, and Valerius had granted the request in exchange for complete cooperation. His statement covered the commission, the design, the renewal schedule, and the name of the intermediary. A name that produced a visible reaction in the assembled crowd, a ripple of recognition, and then recalibration, wolves from the eastern territories exchanging looks with the specific quality of people, discovering that something they had taken for granted was not what it appeared. The intermediary's name led to a family. The family led to a council seat. The council seat led to a network of investment in the current territorial boundary system that was, Valerius's lead investigator explained in the flat, factual tone of someone presenting evidence rather than editorializing, worth considerably more than anything the pack system's original architects had imagined. The false order, Evadne thought, listening. Built by people with enough to lose that they had decided 27 years ago that burying a child was a reasonable cost of protecting it. The packmates who had witnessed Vane's violence over the years spoke in sequence. 6 of them, who had come forward in the days following the investigators' arrival at Obsidian Ridge. They were brief and specific and did not look at Vane while they spoke, which was its own kind of testimony. A young wolf named Dort, dark-haired, 30 years old, who had been something that resembled a friend for approximately 2 years when they were both 8, and had then pretended not to know her in front of others, stood up without having been called and asked permission to speak. Valerius granted it. Dort looked at Evadne and said, in a voice that didn't waver, "She was kind. She was always kind. Whatever they told you she was never that." He sat down. Evadne looked at the ancient ground beneath her feet and said nothing. The sentences were delivered in the afternoon. Valerius spoke them in the same quiet, flat register he used for things that had been decided and did not require emphasis. He had never, in Evadne's observation, raised his voice for the things that mattered most. The things that mattered most didn't need volume. They needed certainty, and certainty was already present in every word. Garrick. Dissolution of the Obsidian Ridge Alpha title. Seizure of all territorial holdings. Permanent exile from every signatory territory under the First Accord. Vane. Dissolution of Beta rank. Seizure of assets. 20 years labor service in the northern quarries. The same sentence Garrick had delivered on Evadne's behalf in the forest, with one addition, a public acknowledgement, read into the valley record of every act of violence documented in testimony, named, dated, permanent. Caliph. Exile. Clean, complete, without territory or pack affiliation. Not the northern quarries. Valerius had looked at Evadne briefly before delivering this sentence, a look she had interpreted as a question, and she had given a slight shake of her head, because exile was sufficient, and she was not interested in cruelty for its own sake. Caliph's composure broke completely when the sentence was read, not into tears, into something rawer than tears, the specific, total dissolution of a person who has organized their entire existence around a position and has just been told the position is gone. She made a sound that Evadne had never heard from her in 18 years. She didn't look. The members of the council network, the investors, the intermediaries, the people who had funded and protected the suppression from a comfortable distance for 27 years, were named individually into the Valley record, their assets frozen pending investigation. There were 11 of them. Some were present, some were not. All of them would be found. The sun was going down when Valerius finished. The Valley of the First Accord held its silence for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the tiered formations, from one wolf, and then another, and then a dozen, and then a sound that moved through the entire assembled valley, the way the celestial howl had moved through the world 6 days ago, building from a single point outward until it was everywhere simultaneously. Recognition. Not for Valerius. For her. Evadne stood in the ancient ground in her plain gray clothes, with her ordinary dark eyes and her faint silver veins, and let the sound move over her and through her, and did not try to contain what it did to the hollow in her chest that had been there for 18 years. It filled it. Simply, completely, without remainder. It filled it. Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to Seraphina's romance stories if you stand with justice. Please subscribe to this channel. He found her at the edge of the valley after the crowds had gone. She had stayed while the assembled wolves departed, standing in the ancient ceremonial ground while the tiered formations emptied and the evening settled over the Valley of the First Accord, with the particular quality of quiet that follows significant events, that specific atmospheric aftermath of something enormous having occurred, and the world still in the process of adjusting to its new shape. She had stayed until the last wolf was gone. Then she had walked to the eastern edge of the valley, where the ancient ground met the tree line, and she had sat down in the grass with her back against a stone that was older than the pack system, and looked at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Valerius found her there. He came without his guard. She heard him approach from a distance, his footsteps carrying the quality of someone who was not trying to be quiet, but was quiet anyway, and she didn't turn around. She heard him stop behind her, and then heard the grass compress as he sat down beside her, not close enough to touch, and followed her gaze up to the emerging stars. They sat in silence for a while. It was, she thought, one of his particular gifts. The ability to be in silence without filling it, without performing patience or making his waiting felt as pressure. He was simply present, and the presence was enough. And she had grown accustomed to it in a way that she suspected was going to be difficult to undo if it was ever withdrawn. She thought about that. The council network, she said. The people who funded the suppression. Will they all be found? Yes, he said. And the original commissioner? The one above the intermediary? We have a name, he said. An arrest will be made within the week. She nodded. The stars continued to appear one by one in the darkening sky above the valley. Dort came, she said. I saw. I hadn't thought about him in years. She paused. I had thought about him. I just told myself I hadn't. Valerius said nothing. She could feel his attention on the side of her face. That quality of focused, complete presence directed at her without demand. I spent a long time, she said, telling myself that things didn't matter to me, that I didn't want them, that the absence of them was fine. She looked at the grass between her hands. It was a practical decision. You can't grieve what you've decided you never wanted. No, he said quietly, but you can't have it either. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she had catalogued over 12 days of evenings, as the one he wore when he was saying something he had thought about carefully and was delivering with precision rather than impulse. "Evadne," he said. Her name in his voice had accumulated meaning over 12 days. She was aware of this. She was aware of the specific, documented warmth in her chest that accompanied it, and of the fourth line of a 7-line prophecy, and of the mate bond that Soren had explained in the careful, factual language of a healer, ensuring informed understanding. She was aware of all of it. She was also aware that she had spent 18 years in a situation where her choices had been made for her, and that she had opinions about that. "I know what the bond is," she said. "I know what the prophecy says. I know what the silver veins mean, and what Soren's texts describe, and what you felt in the clearing and what I felt when you arrived." She held his gaze. "I know all of it." "Yes," he said. "Then why haven't you said it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because knowing it and choosing it are different things," he said. "And you have spent 18 years in a life where that distinction was not honored." He looked at her steadily. "I am not Garrick. I am not a man who takes what the situation appears to offer and calls it consent. What you are to me, what this bond means, what I want. None of it gives me the right to your answer." He paused. "Only you give me that right. And only if you choose to." She looked at him for a long time, at the tiredness around his eyes that was still there, would probably always be there. The deep, structural tiredness of a man who had been responsible for an enormous weight for a very long time. At the controlled expression with the thing beneath it that she had spent 12 days learning to read, the thing that was not controlled at all, that was simply being held, still out of a discipline so practiced it had become almost invisible. At the man who had walked into a forest and knelt in front of a celestial wolf and called her his beautiful queen before he knew her name. At the man who had sat beside her bed and argued about the 3rd chapter and listened to her laugh with an expression she hadn't had a name for then and had a name for now. At the man who had covered her hand on an open page and knelt on ancient ground in the morning light with the full, deliberate intention of someone who had made a permanent decision and was making sure she knew it without requiring her to make the same one. She thought about the 4th line. Her mate will be the anchor, and the anchor will hold. She thought about 18 years of reaching into a void and finding nothing, and about what it had felt like to stand in a frost-ringed field at dawn and discover that the void had never been real. She thought about the word choosing, and what it meant to do it without debt or obligation or the accumulated pressure of 18 years of being told she was lucky to be kept. She looked at him. "Valerius," she said. His jaw tightened fractionally, the only visible evidence of how much was resting on the next few words, carefully, deliberately contained. "Ask me," she said. Something shifted in his face. The control didn't dissolve. It was too deep in him for that. But it became, for a moment, transparent. What was behind it was visible. What was behind it was enormous and patient, and had been waiting, she understood, for considerably longer than 12 days. He reached across and took her hand. "Will you have me?" he said quietly. Not a declaration, not a claim. A question asked plainly by a man who meant it as plainly as it sounded. She looked at their hands. She looked at the ancient ground of the Valley of the First Accord and the first stars of the evening, and the tree line where an old stone held the warmth of a day she would remember for the rest of her life. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. Simply, completely, without remainder. The words settled between them with the specific, quiet weight of something true. Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to Seraphina's romance stories if you stand with justice.
They held it at dawn, not because ceremony required it. The mate bond ritual had no specified time in the ancient texts, no astronomical condition or seasonal alignment that needed to be satisfied. They held it at dawn because Evadne had asked for it, quietly, the evening before, and Valerius had said yes without asking why. He understood why. Dawn was when the seal had broken. Dawn was when the celestial form had risen. Dawn was when the frost-ringed circle had appeared in the grass of an open field, and she had pressed her hand to her sternum and felt, for the first time, the full truth of what she carried. Dawn was when she had become, in the fullest sense, herself. It was the right time to begin what came next. The ceremony ground was the same field. Valerius had arranged it without announcement. Word had moved through the assembled wolves who had remained in the valley's surrounding encampment with the particular speed of information that people have been waiting for, and by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, they were there. Not the thousands of the trial. This was smaller, more specific. The wolves who had stayed, the members of Valerius's court. Sorin, standing to the left with the pre-territorial volume and the quiet expression of a man watching something he has spent a career believing was theoretical become actual. And at the front, small and upright and wearing an expression of concentrated solemnity that kept threatening to dissolve into something less solemn, George. Evadne had sent for her the morning after the trial. She had arrived the previous evening, escorted by 2 of Valerius's guard, and had walked across the encampment and directly into Evadne's arms without a word. And they had stayed like that for a long time, and neither of them had said anything that needed to be said in words. George was standing at the front now in a new coat that Sorin had apparently procured from somewhere, her dark eyes tracking everything with the bright, comprehensive attention of a child who understood that this was important and intended to miss nothing. Evadne looked at her once when she took her position at the center of the frost-marked field. George gave her a nod of such grave ceremonial encouragement that Evadne nearly lost her composure entirely. She held it. The ancient healer who conducted the ritual was called Mira. She was the oldest wolf Evadne had ever seen. Not in the way that age presented itself in ordinary wolves, the gradual accumulation of years in the body's surface, but in the deeper way, the way of something that has existed long enough that time has stopped being the primary way it is measured. She moved with the careful deliberateness of great age and the complete steadiness of someone who had conducted this ritual before and understood its weight in a way that was experiential rather than scholarly. She had conducted it, she told Evadne, holding her hands and looking at her with eyes that were very calm and very direct, 3 times in 90 years. She had never conducted it for a lichen protectress. She said this not as a disclaimer but as an acknowledgement, the recognition of one ancient thing by another. Then she released Evadne's hands and began. The ritual was simple in its physical components. An exchange of blood drawn from the palm with the silver ceremonial blade. Evadne's, then Valerius's, their cut hands pressed together while Mira spoke the old words in pre-territorial Wolfic. A binding cord of woven silver thread wrapped once around their joined wrists, the words spoken back by each of them in turn, not vows in the way that human marriage ceremonies used vows, not promises about future behavior, but statements of present truth. What you are to me, what I am to you, what this means. Valerius spoke his without looking away from her face. She spoke hers without her voice wavering once. When Mira removed the cord and stepped back, the mate bond completed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the explosive light of the awakening or the valley-filling sound of the celestial howl. It was quieter than both of those things and more total. A warmth that moved from their joined hands through Evadne's blood and settled into the hollow of her chest with the specific, permanent quality of something that had found the place it was always meant to occupy and had no intention of leaving. The hollow filled, not the way it had filled in the valley when the assembled wolves recognized her. That had been external, moving inward. This was internal, moving outward. Something that had been at her center since before she was born, shaped specifically for this and waiting, filling from the inside with a warmth so complete that the edges of where she ended and the world began felt for a moment more permeable than usual. She looked at Valerius. He was looking at her with the expression she had finally named 2 days ago, sitting in the grass of the valley's eastern edge. It was the expression of someone who had found what they were looking for. Around them, the assembled wolves began to howl, not in the orchestrated ceremonial way of formal pack rituals, in the spontaneous, irrepressible way of creatures responding to something true. It started with the wolves nearest to them and spread outward through the encampment in the same pattern the celestial howl had spread. One voice becoming 2, becoming 20, becoming a sound that climbed the dawn sky and occupied it completely. The ancient wolves at the perimeter of the field, the eldest of the gathered packs, those who had felt the awakening most deeply 6 days ago and had traveled the furthest to be present, bowed their heads. Not to Valerius, to her. Evadne stood in the frost-marked field in the early dawn light, bonded and recognized and belonging, fully, completely, without caveat, for the first time in her life. George was crying at the front of the crowd, making absolutely no effort to conceal it. Sorin beside her was doing the same and pretending he wasn't. Mira stood with her hands folded and her ancient eyes calm and an expression of profound satisfaction on her face, the expression of someone who has waited a long time for something to be correctly done and has finally, at the end of a very long career, watched it happen. And Valerius, who had not let go of her hand since Mira unwound the cord, looked down at her and said nothing, because nothing was required, because everything had already been said in the only language that mattered. The bond held. It would always hold.
Please subscribe to this channel. 7 months later, Evadne walked into the Ashfall forest alone. Not fleeing, not hunted, not with bare feet on frozen flint or blood running into her eyes or the rhythmic thunder of paws vibrating through the earth behind her. She walked in at mid-morning on a day in late spring, when the light came through the canopy in long, shifting columns, and the forest floor was soft with new growth, and the air smelled like pine and thawed earth, and the particular green freshness of a world that had decided after a long winter to continue. She wore boots. This was not a small thing to her, and she didn't pretend it was. She walked without hurrying, because there was nothing to outrun. The forest that had been the setting of her execution was simply a forest now. Ancient trees and dappled light, and the small, continuous sounds of things living their lives in the spaces between human awareness. It had always been just a forest. The terror had never been in the trees. She walked to the oak. It was easy to find. She had thought it might not be. Had thought the landmarks of extreme fear might not translate to ordinary navigation. That the geography of a night spent running for your life might not correspond to the geography of a morning walk. But she found it without difficulty, because the forest hadn't changed, and her memory was precise, and the roots were exactly as she remembered them, gnarled and enormous, the bark marked with a faint scar, where the impact of her head had left its record in the wood. She stood in front of it for a while. The clearing looked different in daylight. Of course it did. Everything looks different in daylight, stripped of the particular drama that darkness and crisis impose on ordinary spaces. The clearing was not large. The oak was very large, genuinely ancient, its canopy spreading wide above the surrounding space and filtering the morning light into something soft and moving. The roots she had pressed her back against were impressive in their size and complexity, the kind of roots that accumulated over centuries of a tree deciding to stay exactly where it was. She put her hand on the bark. The tree was indifferent to her, as trees are indifferent to everything, conducting the slow, enormous business of its existence without reference to what happened at its base. It had been here before the Obsidian Ridge Pack. It would be here after. It had been here before the territorial consolidation and the pack system and the prophetic appendix in the pre-territorial volume and the suppression working and every human and wolf drama that had played out in its immediate vicinity. She found this deeply, genuinely comforting. She stayed for a while, her hand on the bark, and then she turned and walked back through the forest the way she had come. The stronghold had changed in 7 months. Not structurally, the same stone, the same corridors, the same vaulted eastern tower where she had woken to her first silence. But the quality of it had changed, the atmospheric texture of a place that is now organized around different things than it used to be. The investigation into the council network had concluded with 11 convictions and the dissolution of a boundary management apparatus that had, it turned out, been quietly extracting resource from the outer territories for decades. The territorial system was being rebuilt on a foundation that didn't have a falsification at its center. This was slow work. It would be slow for years. Evadne was part of it. Not ceremonially, not in the way that the Luna title had historically meant a primarily symbolic adjacency to the Alpha King's authority. She had made clear in the first weeks that she had opinions about governance and intended to have them heard, and Valerius had made equally clear that this was not a problem for him, which was one of the many things she had added in those early weeks to the list of reasons she had made the right choice. She sat in council meetings and asked the questions that disrupted comfortable assumptions. She had established, with Soren's help, a formal review of the pack welfare standards across the outer territories, the parts of the territorial system that the council network had most thoroughly neglected, where omegas and unmated wolves and the wolves at the bottom of every pack hierarchy had been living in conditions that the people at the top of every pack hierarchy had found it convenient not to examine. She examined them. She was, she had discovered, very good at examining things that other people found it convenient not to look at. 18 years of being the thing that was inconvenient to acknowledge had given her an unusually clear view of how that worked. George was learning to read Old Wolfic. She had announced this intention approximately 3 weeks after their arrival at the stronghold, in the direct, declarative way she announced most of her intentions, and Soren had responded by beginning her lessons the following morning with the enthusiasm of a scholar who has been waiting for an adequately motivated student. She was, Soren reported with great satisfaction, exceptional. She was also, at 11 years old, conducting a thorough social assessment of the stronghold's junior staff population and had identified several who she considered promising. Evadne watched this process with a recognition that was partly fond and partly the specific, slightly awed recognition of someone watching a person become entirely and completely themselves. George would be fine. George would be more than fine. Valerius was in the map room when Evadne returned from the forest. She knew this before she reached the door. Knew it the way she knew most things about his location and state, through the mate bond that had become, over 7 months, as integrated into her ordinary awareness as her own heartbeat. Present, warm, directional, carrying the faint signature of his mood, the way weather carries the signature of what's coming. He was focused. He was tired in the structural way he was always tired. He was, underneath both of those things, content. She stood in the doorway. He was at the large table, bent over a territorial map with the focused attention he brought to everything, one hand pressed flat on the map's edge, the other holding a notation pen. He hadn't heard her yet. She watched him for a moment. The tiredness around his eyes that had not disappeared and probably wouldn't, the controlled expression, the thing beneath the control that was no longer hidden from her, because she had learned every layer of him in 7 months of evenings and mornings and everything between. He looked up. The expression he wore when he found her in a room was still one of her favorite things in the world. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. She came into the room and sat in the chair across the table from him. "Just a forest." He looked at her steadily. "Just a forest." "Full of light," she said. "In the morning." Something shifted in his expression. That fractional, deliberate transparency that he offered her now, without the cost it had carried before. The thing beneath the control made briefly, intentionally visible. "Good," he said quietly. She leaned forward and looked at the map. At the territories spreading outward from the stronghold in every direction. The outer reaches, the border zones, the places she hadn't been yet and intended to go. The enormous, complicated, imperfect world that was in the process of being rebuilt on better foundations, slowly, by people who were willing to do slow work. She thought about a girl running through a dark forest with bare feet and blood in her eyes, praying for a quick end. She thought about the oak tree, indifferent and ancient, conducting the business of its existence without reference to what happened at its base. She thought about 7 months of evenings in a room that had started to feel like somewhere she was allowed to exist without apology, and about the difference between being kept and being chosen, and about the specific, permanent warmth in her chest that had filled the hollow completely and had not, in 7 months, wavered once. She thought about Boots. The girl they had once hunted through the dark as a defect had become a queen whose name would be remembered long after every one of her tormentors had turned to dust. She had walked back through the forest this morning in the spring light, unhurried, unafraid, entirely and completely herself, and she had never had to run again. Kindly do us a favor and subscribe to Seraphina's romance stories if you stand with justice.